text generator, ChatGPT, and this has now become a global sensation. We've talked about ChatGPT and all of these things at length, but what is hardly ever talked about is Sam Altman himself, the main man leading the revolution in AI. Those who are following along in the technology space either see him as a villain or the future savior of the world. In today's episode, we'll take a look at Altman's history, his inner psyche, and his motivations for launching the company OpenAI.
You are watching Fusion TV.
AI news is everywhere at the moment, so wouldn't it make sense to know how it works? That's where today's sponsor, Brilliant.org, comes in. It's the best way to learn STEM subjects. Brilliant has an interactive course on computer science, which includes neural networks. You can read about AI all you want, but Brilliant actually tests your learning and understanding in a fun way. If you're looking to brush up on your STEM knowledge or just want to satisfy your curiosity, Brilliant can help you reach your goals. I particularly enjoyed the Introduction to Neural Networks course. It was a great refresher and really solidifies the building blocks of what Sam Altman is talking about. Go to brilliant.org/coldfusion or click the link in the description to get a 30-day free trial. The first 200 people will get 20% off their annual subscription. Okay, so back to the video. Sam Altman was born on April 22nd, 1985 in Chicago, Illinois. As a child, he was incredibly curious and had a passion for science and technology. At just the age of 8, he got his first computer, a Macintosh SE. That computer became his gateway to the world. He would soon discover AOL chat rooms. It was transformational for him in his early development as a person. Although precocious and nerdy, he was quite a bold kid. At the age of 16, he would come out to his parents as homosexual. At the time, he was attending John Burroughs School, a private prep school in St. Louis, Missouri. There were incidents at the school about his sexuality that caused him to think a bit differently and challenge the world with new ideas. After graduating high school, he got into Stanford University to study computer science. Soon though, with two of his classmates, he started developing a mobile app called Looped. This was the early era of Facebook and Twitter. Everyone was curious about what each other was up to and what was on their mind, but no one was able to share their location just yet. Looped was based on this exact idea. It told your friends where you were. Although somewhat frowned upon for security reasons today, back then in the early 2000s, it was a cool and novel idea. Looped was one of the first mobile apps that allowed users to share their location selectively with other people. To give you some context, Google Maps was launched in 2005, but its location sharing feature was added in 2017. Twitter and Facebook implemented the feature in 2009 and 2010 respectively. Seeing the potential, Altman dropped out of Stanford in 2005 to establish his company, but what he would need was a substantial amount of investment to further develop the product. Luckily, he received funding from Y Combinator and Sequoia Capital. At this point, remember the name Y Combinator. It will be a major part of Sam Altman's life, which we'll cover in the next part of the episode. In the summer of 2005, Altman worked tirelessly. He was meeting with mobile carriers and convincing them to feature the app. Back then, there was no app store. Neither Google nor Apple was providing a service like that. Remember, smartphones look like this. So knocking on the mobile carriers' doors was the only option. His hard work did soon pay off, and the app's valuation rose to $175 million. Despite the valuation, consumers never bought the app. Altman later would say to The New Yorker, quote, "We had the optimistic view that location would be all important. The pessimistic view was that people would lie on their couches and just consume content. And that is what happened." End quote. In 2012, he and other founders sold the company for $43 million. After selling the company, he broke up with his long-term partner, Nick Sevo, who was also the co-founder of Looped. So this was a major setback both in his personal and professional life. Despite the blow, he made a name for himself. Remember Y Combinator? A seed-stage venture firm that has funded many successful startups like Reddit, Airbnb, Dropbox, Twitch, and Sam Altman's now obscure Looped. Altman had failed to establish his first company, but he had caught the attention of Paul Graham, the co-founder of Y Combinator. Looped was one of the first 8 companies that Y Combinator funded. Paul Graham was impressed by Sam's tenacity and entrepreneurial spirit. He asked Sam to become a part-time partner at Y Combinator in 2011. Altman joined and helped build key parts of the Y Combinator experience for founders. Later in 2014, he'd become president when Paul Graham and his co-founder wife, Jessica Livingston, stepped down to look after their 2 young children. Altman is a force to be reckoned with. He has a calm demeanor, but sometimes that can be replaced with a frightening temper, but that's only when it's crossed. He's quirky and somewhat of an oddball. Once at a party, when asked about his hobbies, he famously remarked, quote, "Well, I like racing cars. I have 5, including 2 McLarens and an old Tesla. I like flying rented planes all over California. Oh, and an odd one, I prep for survival." Seeing the bemused look on the faces of his audience, he further explained, quote, "My problem is that when my friends get drunk, they talk about the ways the world will end. After a Dutch lab modified the H5N1 bird flu virus 5 years ago, making it super contagious, the chance of a lethal synthetic virus being released in the next 20 years, well, non-zero." The other most popular scenario would be AI that attacks the US and nations fighting with nukes over scarce resources. Just to clarify though, Altman said all of this in 2016. We all know what happened 3 years later in late 2019. As the Wall Street Journal reports, according to American government officials, it was the lackluster precautions taken at a research lab in China that caused a deadly virus to break out and caused the whole world to experience an insufferable pandemic. I'm not going to get into discussing that here, but the point is, Altman was surely onto something that most people were oblivious to. But what about the scenario of AI attacking? Well, he took steps to make sure that this wouldn't happen. We'll get to that later. Besides his quirky nature, he really did want to change the world, but not in a scummy Elizabeth Holmes kind of way. After selling his first company, Looped, Sam launched a small venture fund called Hydrozyme Capital. It would fund technology companies in education, specialty foods, hospitality, consumer networks, enterprise software, and internet-connected hardware. Sam became known for his ability to spot hidden gems and fix their flaws. Interestingly, Altman invested in and briefly served as the CEO of Reddit. He helped the company raise $50 million in 2014 when it was in shambles. Altman also has a passion for nuclear energy, and he's invested and joined on the boards of multiple fission and fusion startups. His reasoning? A challenging business tends to attract more interest. Think about it this way. So you want to create another social media startup. If you pitched the idea, you'd probably get a bored look from your potential investors. But if you were to create an AI company with the computer science know-how to back it, suddenly, everyone wants to do the same thing. As Sam progressed in his professional endeavors, he became a powerful figure in Silicon Valley. As his mentor Paul Graham notes, Sam is extremely good at becoming powerful. 2012 was an interesting year for AI. Geoffrey Hinton releases a seminal paper that proved for the first time that neural networks could recognize objects as accurately as humans. In this same year, in 2012, Altman was out hiking with some of his friends in the north of San Francisco. They were discussing human intelligence and AI. As the discussion went on, Altman suddenly realized that humans are not as unique as he thought. He felt that there was no reason to believe that in 13 years, the hardware could replace the human brain. Certain things are still uniquely human. For example, genuine creativity, inspiration, the ability to feel, and to truly empathize. But someday, in the future, computers will be able to mimic the outputs of humans. And probably, this is where Sam Altman's fear that one day AI might destroy humanity and strip us of our uniqueness began to manifest. He would keep this revelation close to his chest until much later in 2016, when he opened up in an interview to The New Yorker. He said, quote, "There are certain advantages to being a machine. We humans are limited by our input-output rate. We only learn 2 bits a second, so a ton is lost. To a machine, we must seem like slowed-down whale songs." He knew machines could someday become all too powerful, and he felt he needed to do something. Sam Altman was definitely not alone in his fears. Another key figure in the tech world, Elon Musk, had the same premonition. Musk had always been vocal about it though. While some might think that such a fear would lead them to avoid the creation of an AI company altogether, they opted for a different approach, doing the exact opposite. In 2015, Altman and Musk would join forces with other influential figures, including Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn, Jessica Livingston, co-founder of Y Combinator, and Peter Thiel. This was in addition to some highly qualified AI researchers and entrepreneurs. Another significant member who joined the team as chief scientist of the company in January 2016 was Ilya Sutskever. He's a computer scientist, widely respected in the field of machine learning. Before joining the Musk and Altman project, he was working at Google Brain as a research scientist. The group pledged over $1 billion to fund its operations. They also agreed to make their patents and research open to the public and to collaborate freely with other institutions and researchers, hence the name OpenAI. Initially, they set up OpenAI to be a non-profit entity that would focus on creating artificial general intelligence, or AGI, AI systems that are generally smarter than humans, but in a safe and beneficial way. They were particularly concerned that Google's DeepMind Technologies division was seeking to reign supreme in the field of AI. They thought that Google's DeepMind could monitor the world for competitors and crush them. Musk would say in an interview, quote, "If the AI that they develop goes awry, we risk having an immortal and super powerful dictator forever." He went on, quote, "Murdering all competing AI researchers as its first move strikes me as a bit of a character flaw." OpenAI, the non-profit AI research firm, set off with great excitement and lofty expectations. With a star-studded roster of big-name investors and a grand vision for the future, the world was eager to see what they would accomplish. It was quite evident what they feared, but not so much as what they adopted as their vision. OpenAI's approach was more like a curious explorer, constantly seeking to understand and discover new things. They wanted to create an AI capable of writing a poem or composing a symphony. But developing an AI system like this is not easy. It requires patience, dedication, and a willingness to embrace the unknown. Sam Altman explained the system by comparing it to a child who is just learning about the world. Just like a child, an AI system needs guidance and oversight. That's why OpenAI planned to create a governance board that could allow people from all around the world to have a say in how this technology is being developed and deployed. As time went on though, it became clear that there was some fighting in the ranks. In early 2018, Elon Musk had grown frustrated with the company's progress and suggested that he take control of the operation himself. The other founders of OpenAI, including Sam Altman and CTO Greg Brockman, declined Musk's proposal. A power struggle soon ensued, and Musk, in turn, walked away from the project. Publicly though, OpenAI and Musk both cited the reason as a conflict of interest. And there was some truth to this. Tesla was developing its autonomous driving program, and they had already lured one of OpenAI's engineers for that. Adding fuel to the fire was the fact that Musk had promised to donate roughly $1 billion to the organization over a period of years. He stopped making payments after his departure. This left the non-profit in a precarious position. There are astronomical fees associated with training AI systems on supercomputers. They were going to have to do something. 1 year earlier, in 2017, Google Brain announced a neural network architecture called the Transformer. It became a popular choice for natural language processing tasks such as machine translation and text generation. It was revolutionary in the sense that any AI system could now be trained and improved endlessly as long as you could feed it data, but it was costly. To take advantage of the Transformer model, OpenAI soon made a monumentous decision. They announced that they would be a for-profit entity, capping profits for investors and funneling any excess back into the original non-profit. Altman, however, refused to take any equity in the new entity. The move to for-profit turned off some investors, but less than 6 months later, Microsoft joined hands with OpenAI and initially invested $1 billion. They provided OpenAI with the cloud computing infrastructure to train their massive AI models, which eventually created ChatGPT and the image generator DALL-E. After the huge success of ChatGPT, in January 2023, Microsoft announced an additional $10 billion investment in OpenAI and its technology. In return, Microsoft had gained access to some of the most advanced and popular AI models in the world, and they could deploy it across their consumer and enterprise products at will. In some ways, the deal with Microsoft was a deal with the devil. It would cause OpenAI to diverge from their original ethos. The research is no longer open and free. It's hidden away from the prying eyes of competitors. Microsoft urged the company to stay ahead of the competition and put pressure to release AI products. Microsoft and OpenAI's partnership, as well as ChatGPT's early success, drove Google into a panic. Google has traditionally kept its AI developments under wraps, whereas OpenAI released them to the public for general use. And this was the beginning of the famous AI war, which I've talked about a lot. But because these AI tools are still in their infancy, the results have either been remarkable or absurd thus far. Why would anyone release an unfinished product? According to Sam Altman, the benefits of democratizing such powerful technology far outweigh the potential risks of one individual being in control. Regardless, the cat is out of the bag now, and countless companies are using AI tools for developing their own. And in the world of business, when you see your competitor doing something that generates success, there's going to be a bunch of unlimited copycats. Government and the general populace are behind. The United States only had their first meeting with AI leaders in May of 2023.
And I think my question is, what kind of an innovation is it going to be? Is it going to be like the printing press that diffused knowledge and power and learning widely across the landscape, that empowered ordinary everyday individuals, that led to greater flourishing, that led above all to greater liberty? Or is it going to be more like the atom bomb? Huge technological breakthrough, but the consequences, severe, terrible, continue to haunt us to this day.
Before we released GPT-4, our latest model, we spent over 6 months conducting extensive evaluations, external red teaming, and dangerous capability testing. We are proud of the progress that we made. GPT-4 is more likely to respond helpfully and truthfully and refuse harmful requests than any other widely deployed model of similar capability. However, we think that regulatory intervention by governments will be critical to mitigate the risks of increasingly powerful models.
And the thing is, this is the baby stages of AI. It's only going to get better with time, and fast. Who knows what could happen in the distant future? It could be great, or not so great. In Sam Altman's own words, quote, "I think it'd be crazy not to be a little bit afraid." He also states that superintelligence and rogue AI are not immediate threats. The threats that we face are quite mundane. Misinformation, economic shocks. His solution is to ensure that AI safety is highly aligned with human values. And I'd like to think that the result of this could make a better world for us all, but we still have to be careful.
And already it does miraculous things. At Cincinnati Children's Hospital, Dr. John Pestian and Dr. Tracy Glauser are training their own AI to head off suicide in children. It can give a pediatrician an at-a-glance sense of which kids need immediate intervention.
An output will say this is a patient at high risk, this is a patient at low risk, or we just don't have enough data right now.
Roughly 30 to 40% of mental illness, adult mental illness, started as a child. And so you want to be able to pick that up early.
Technology has always been a driving force in shaping our world. From the invention of the wheel to the internet, every new creation has faced its fair share of criticism. We've all seen the negative sides of the internet, how it can spread misinformation and division. But with AI, this is set to only grow. But hey, we can't just focus on the negatives. AI is already revolutionizing game development, video production, copywriting, coding, and countless other fields. It allows the heavy lifting of cognitive, repetitive work that nobody likes to do to be automated so people can focus on what they enjoy within their profession. And that's a great thing that we have to recognize. There are also those who use it as a tool to enhance their creativity. Of course, there are negatives, but the key is to use this tool as wisely and responsibly as possible. As Isaac Asimov, the famous science fiction writer, once said, quote, "The saddest aspects of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom. So let's do our part to not let that happen. Use these tools with wisdom." But what about the other side? If things do go very wrong with AI in the future, Sam Altman may just become one of the most hated people in history. At that point, it might seem like he started off with pure goals, but ended up becoming the very thing he was trying to prevent. Only time will tell, ultimately. So that's the story of Sam Altman and what his philosophies are. I just find this so fascinating. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon for another video. My name is Dagogo, and you've been watching Cold Fusion. Cheers, guys. Have a good one.
Cold fusion. It's new thinking.
Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. And here it is.
Why in the world would Apple Computer want to jump into the handset market with so much competition?
We use all the handsets out there. It's really frustrating. It's a category that needs to be reinvented.
With over 2 billion units sold, the iPhone is the most influential product of all time. It created the modern smartphone and turned the device into an instant gateway to the world. Everything you desire in the palm of your hand. It changed everything. But where did it come from? If it wasn't a sudden idea from Steve Jobs, who actually came up with the idea? Who are the people that built it? And what are their stories? With the most recent release of the iPhone, it's easy for many people to forget just how revolutionary it once was. Today, we're going to see how it all began and how the pressure of doing the impossible cost some people their marriage and their health. This video will include my exclusive interview with Ken Koshienda, one of the pioneers of the original iPhone. He worked directly with Steve Jobs on the project. This is the secret history of the iPhone.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
To begin our story, we have to go back to the early 2000s. At this time, human-computer interaction was a mess before smart devices. Manipulating digital objects was a chore. In the early 2000s, zooming in on an image usually meant clicking on a menu, selecting the zoom option, and then selecting the amount you wanted to zoom in by. How we zoom in on an image today couldn't be more different. We can simply pinch a screen and manipulate it with our fingers. Back then, such interactions weren't obvious and only became possible with touchscreens. Touchscreens existed back then, but they were predominantly resistive touch. That's the kind of screen where you have to use a lot of force to touch. Think ATM screens or information screens at train stations and airports. On smaller screens, resistive touch is inexact and frustrating. In the 90s, Apple tried to use resistive touch in a device called the Newton, but it failed. Before even dreaming of a device like the iPhone, this was the first problem that had to be solved. By 2007, the world was looking for a new way to approach the mobile phone. They just needed a company to be in the right place at the right time with the right product. You may be surprised to find out that the first seeds of the iPhone came not from Apple, but from a small company in Delaware called Fingerworks. Founded in 1998 by Wayne Westerman, Fingerworks had figured out how to use a different type of technology effectively. It was called capacitive multi-touch. It was fast, responsive, precise, and most importantly, smart enough to recognize multiple fingers and what they were trying to do. I reached out to Wayne for an interview, but unfortunately, after his company was bought by Apple in 2005, he was whisked away and sworn to secrecy. He couldn't give me any interviews about his work. In the early 2000s, Fingerworks released a trackpad called the iGesture. It helped people with wrist injuries easily use a computer without aggravating their injury. Wayne Westerman, the founder of Fingerworks, had suffered from a wrist condition himself. Sometimes he couldn't type more than a page without his wrist suffering. Instead of despairing, this condition motivated him to innovate new solutions for his university research paper, and this resulted in the Fingerworks technology. Wayne even wrote a simple AI program to help the system understand the differences between accidental and intentional touches. When gestures were performed, the pad would interpret them and turn the movements into computer shortcuts, like copy, paste, and scroll. Wayne Westerman and Fingerworks would play a critical role in the development of the iPhone. Here's Ken Koshienda to talk about it a bit more.
My name is Ken Koshienda, and for many years I worked at Apple, from 2001 until 2017. In 2005, I was asked to join the iPhone project. I had very good experience working with Wayne. But back at the beginning, he had a company called Fingerworks, which is an independent company which Apple bought, part for the technology and part to get him because he was so talented.
Early on, Steve Jobs hated the idea of Apple making a phone. He was concerned about a lack of focus in the company, the precise issue that he'd solved on his return to Apple in 1997. Steve Jobs believed that a phone would only serve a niche geek market. Cell phones at the time were not the easiest to use, so you can understand why it wouldn't have seemed right for a trendy company like Apple to get into this market. As we all know, this sentiment would later change. Meanwhile, within Apple, a group of engineers and software designers would meet weekly in what used to be a user testing room. They were all from different departments, but united by curiosity and imagination. They realized that the web and digital revolution was bringing richer and ever more complex media to computers. They realized that clicking and typing may not be the best way to navigate this new future. What if there was a more fluid way to interact with content? With this idea, they would start an informal human-computer interaction group within Apple. Their goal was to improve our interactions with technology. One day in 2002, an Apple employee by the name of Tina Huang brought a Fingerworks device to work due to a wrist injury. It was a black, rectangular pad that allowed the seamless execution of complicated computer tasks by just the use of her fingers. The Fingerworks touchpad was seen by some curious Apple human interaction employees in their user testing room. Because they were already thinking of new ways to interact with technology, to them, multi-touch interaction was an interesting prospect. Inspired, they whipped up a demo to show Apple's marketing department. Using the multi-touch gesture pad and a projector, they displayed an interactive image of macOS. The idea was that you could use finger-based gestures on the pad to manipulate elements of the desktop software. The demo was met with minimal enthusiasm from the marketing team. They just didn't see a need for it, and how could they? There was no product that would really need it. Unfazed, the interaction group continued to have weekly meetings to discuss the possibilities. Johnny Ive, who was one of the weekly members of the informal group, had also shown Steve Jobs the concept. Initially, Jobs rejected it. He remarked that it would only be good for, quote, reading something on a toilet, end quote. Johnny Ive, being of a sensitive nature, took the comment personally and was hurt by it. After some further thought, however, Jobs warmed up to the idea and the project would be greenlit, but it became riddled with problems and was ultimately shut down. In July of 2004, Steve Jobs had a surgery to remove a tumor in his pancreas. The realization that he might have a limited time on this planet helped accelerate the timetable of what needed to be done at Apple.
About a year ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. I had a scan at 7:30 in the morning, and it clearly showed a tumor on my pancreas. I didn't even know what a pancreas was. The doctors told me this was almost certainly a type of cancer that is incurable, and that I should expect to live no longer than 3 to 6 months. I've looked in the mirror every morning and asked myself, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I am about to do today? And whenever the answer has been no for too many days in a row, I know I need to change something. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking and don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it.
Around this time, Tony Fadell, who led the successful iPod division, suggested to Jobs that it would be a good idea to put Wi-Fi in an iPod. While Jobs thought about it, Tony and his small team would get to work on a new iPod, a PDA hybrid prototype. The result was a disaster. Imagine an iPod with modified software allowing users to navigate the web with a click wheel. Jobs hated it. He understood that it worked, but thought it was a rubbish experience. Jobs told Tony to try another way. In 2005, Bas Ording, a programmer and UI designer, received a call from Steve Jobs asking him to make a demo of a touch interface of a scrolling list. Steve now wanted to do a touchscreen phone. Demos were the way that Apple as a company worked through creative concepts and ideas to see what could be the next product.
And then we would make demos and something you could try out right away. And the thing is, these first demos and prototypes are never any good. You think that there is going to be some genius aha moment, but it never works like that. Well, hopefully there's some little kernel in there. There's some aspect of it that's stronger than other aspects of it. And so you go and look for those strong parts. Natural world uses natural selection generation after generation, improving and improving. In technology, we have creative selection, taking our ideas and building up a product from these humble beginnings. It's a long, iterative, evolutionary process.
While Ording was making the contactless demo, he noticed that when scrolling, the text image would suddenly stop when he hit the bottom of the screen. Because of this sudden stopping of all the motion, he thought that his code had crashed. After some time, Ording noticed that he had in fact reached the end of the list. This gave him an idea. Why not have the image bounce so that there's some visual feedback that lets you feel like you've reached the end of the list, and not like it suddenly crashed? This was the genesis of the rubber banding effect on the iPhone. When Steve saw Ording's rubber banding effect for the first time, he realized that a phone could indeed have a touch interface. While work on the scrolling list demo was happening, other touchscreen projects were secretly going on at Apple as well. As cool as these demos were, they were no more than a bunch of disjointed concepts. Some pinching and zooming here, a few widgets there, some notes and a calculator, but nothing with a unified structure. Steve wasn't impressed with the disjointed array of demos. Didn't seem like there was a product to sell. In early 2005, Jobs gave the team 2 weeks to create something great, and it had to be great, or else. A small team at Apple spent 2 sleepless weeks trying to get the company's first touchscreen phone right. They focused on the vision of a phone and its function. How do you make a phone call on a touchscreen? How do you get from a calendar to web browsing? What's the logical flow of getting from one application to another? Amazingly, by the end of the 2-week period, they had something to show Jobs. The first time Steve Jobs saw the prototype, he didn't jump for joy or exclaim anything. He was silent. Sitting back, he said, "Show it to me again." He was, in fact, blown away. The project would be top secret within Apple from that point forward. Around the same time, Apple would purchase Fingerworks, bringing Fingerworks' whole team on board to try and help figure out this new jackpot. So now, Apple had 2 choices on how to transform this technology into a product. 1. Enlarge the already successful iPod into a phone, or 2. Shrink macOS down into a phone using Fingerworks touch technology. Nobody knew which would work best, so Steve let both ideas run. The iPod enlarging team was led by Tony Fadell, and the multi-touch macOS team was led by Scott Forstall. Forstall's team was seen as the underdogs. After all, Tony Fadell had helped push millions of iPod sales and was also working on 2 smash hits, the iPod Nano and the iPod Video. The battle had begun. Neither team was allowed to know what each other was doing. In fact, the hardware guys weren't allowed to see any software, and the software guys weren't allowed to see any hardware. Hardly anyone working on the phone at Apple knew what the device was going to look like until the keynote, and they weren't given a solid date for that either. During the stress, some members would quit, and others would be fired. At one point, Phil Schiller, head of marketing, had had enough and thought that both projects should be scrapped. An Apple phone with a BlackBerry-style keyboard seemed like the most sensible option. While these projects were going, top Apple executives convinced Jobs that something needed to be done about encroaching MP3-capable mobile phone sales, and quickly. Jobs agreed to partner with Motorola, the coolest phone company at the time, with their thin Razr phone. They would make an iTunes phone. The idea was people would try out iTunes on the phone and then hopefully go off and buy an iPod. Apple would have no involvement in the hardware, only focusing on iTunes integration. The result was the Motorola Rocker. Already outdated on release, the thing just sucked.
I go there and I just resume my music right back to where it was.
Well, I was supposed to resume my music right back to where it was. I hit the wrong button. But you can resume your music right back to where it was if you hit the right button.
The rocker was so bad that it was soon being returned at a rate of 6 times higher than the industry average. Consumers were expecting something big from Apple, and this wasn't it. After the Motorola failure, Jobs returned his attention back to the iPod phone, which was Tony Fadell's team, as it was the safer option. He still did leave the Touch macOS team led by Scott Forstall to continue. Tony's team tried a plethora of designs, one of which was similar to an iPod video, but with a phone mode. If you wanted music, it would behave like a regular iPod with touch controls for play, pause, etc. around a scroll wheel. When you needed to dial a number, you would switch it into phone mode and the device would behave like a rotary phone. It wasn't perfect, but Jobs still insisted that the idea could work. Nobody within Apple really knew what this new device was. The iPod team saw it as another portable accessory like the iPod, so software wasn't important. The Touch macOS team, on the other hand, saw it as a fully fledged, multi-touch computer that fit in your hand. Tony Fadell and his team were certain that this new phone should run a beefed-up version of iPod software, while Scott Forstall and his team thought a shrunken-down version of macOS would be better. They theorized that mobile chip technology had become powerful enough to run a version of macOS. It was juddery at first, but soon they managed to get scrolling to work smoothly on a compact version of macOS. And from this point, it was decided that this would be the way to go. The shrunken-down version of macOS would become known as iOS, and soon, Tony Fadell's iPod phone idea would be abandoned, and all efforts would be focused on iOS. As the software began to take place, details had to be ironed out. How do you unlock this thing without doing it by accident in your pocket? There's actually an interesting story to how this was solved. One day, Freddie Anzers, a user interface designer within Apple, found the solution in the most unlikely of places: a toilet. One day, Freddie was on a US domestic flight and felt the need to relieve himself. He got up from his seat and went to the toilet. As Freddie locked the cubicle door, he happened to observe the locking mechanism. It was so simple. You just slide it to unlock, and that's it. This concept lit a light bulb, and the result was the famous original slide to unlock feature. To test out this concept, an iPhone engineer later gave a prototype to his 3-year-old daughter. Without hesitation, she took her finger, slid and unlocked the phone. If a 3-year-old could figure it out, anyone could. Meanwhile, Johnny Ive was beginning to imagine what the hardware of this phone could look like. Although later designs would stray, the first sketch from Johnny Ive was close to the final product. He was imagining an infinity pool. Quote, "This pond where the display would magically appear, the rest of the device had to get out of the way." End quote. Interestingly, Johnny Ive didn't want a headphone jack in the original iPhone. As the project dragged on, tempers rose within the company due to secrecy, competition, and the time pressure of the project, and it was no wonder. Everything the teams were making was new. Touchscreen technology was in its infancy. The Apple engineers had to figure out how to make a transparent version of multi-touch mass-producible. Untested custom chips had to be developed. Cell reception had to be worked out. Material designs needed to be perfected. Basically, these teams, which had never made a phone before, were now trying to make the most ambitious device ever imagined. Imagine how it must have been for the developers too. If any app they were working on crashed, it could have been because of virtually a million things, from their coding to any one of the numerous experimental hardware components. By February of 2006, the team at Apple still didn't have a CPU, basically the brain of the device, and they were supposed to ship in a year. They decided to contract Samsung, who they'd partnered with previously for chips within the iPod. They asked Samsung if they had any powerful CPUs within certain specifications, and they did, but the only thing Samsung had was from a cable box. Without telling Samsung about the iPhone, Apple said they would need modifications to this chip in just 6 months. This is much less than half the usual development time for a new chip, and this would later cause problems. By early 2006, the iOS software was making great progress. But the keyboard still sucked. It was just too small to type on, and it failed in all of the demos. Without a good keyboard, the whole phone wouldn't have worked. Realizing that the entire project was in jeopardy, Scott Forstall paused all development of applications on iOS and made everyone focus on the keyboard issue. Everyone on the team built keyboards for 3 straight weeks. When it came time to test the results of their work, they all still were no good, and there was only one engineer left to demonstrate his keyboard. It was Ken Koshienda. Nervously, he set it up for Scott to type on. Surprisingly, it worked, and it was accurate. The breakthrough was made by using primitive AI to figure out what was actually being typed, essentially predictive text. For example, if you were to type the letter T, there was a high chance you're going to type the letter H next. So the keyboard would make the contact region for H larger without changing the appearance of the button to the naked eye. Ken also had the foresight to use a dictionary to power suggestions and autocorrect.
It was clear to me after the first couple of demos that since the screen was so small and since there was no tactile feedback on the touch screen, that there was going to need to be some new element. Now, my first ideas were different shaped keys, different ways of highlighting the keys so that you would just move your fingers, but that was a failed idea. That didn't work. And so it was the dictionary and software assistance, the notion that some code running in the background, looking at your touches on the screen and trying to figure out, well, what did you mean? And so combining that notion with the notion of a dictionary and a lot of work and a lot of experimentation helped to produce that first result of autocorrection for the first iPhone.
Without Ken's ideas in that high-pressure moment, it's possible that the iPhone wouldn't have made it off the ground. As it was all coming down to the wire for Apple, disaster struck. Just 3 months before the launch, the custom CPU chips from Samsung still had bugs that caused the phones to crash. With such little time left on the clock, it was looking like a catastrophe was in the making. As stress built, engineers started working 7 days a week, and some slept in their offices. Tempers flared, and employees shouted at each other. One employee slammed a door so hard out of frustration that the door handle broke and she got trapped in her office and had to be broken out with a baseball bat. It seemed like the iPhone, which held so much promise, would be Apple's greatest disaster. Other aspects of the iPhone were still being slapped on very late in the product development cycle. One of its killer apps, Google Maps, was only added as an afterthought. On the hardware side, the original iPhone screen was supposed to be plastic like the iPods, but the decision to use glass was made 1 month after the launch. When the day of the keynote came on January 9th, 2007, none of the teams at Apple knew exactly what the final iPhone product would look like, even though they had worked on the project for years. When Steve Jobs took to the stage, some things were still incomplete. The iPhone's buggy CPU issue hadn't been properly solved yet, only patched up for the demo. This meant that the phone could crash at any time during the presentation. The Apple team held their breath, sweating, as they sat and watched Steve Jobs excitedly proclaim, and were calling it iPhone. There was mostly a positive reaction from the crowd, but also some uncertain laughter, as some thought that Jobs was joking about the name. Yet, the demo was going well. The crowd was loving the smooth scrolling and technological magic they were witnessing.
There we go, right there. And to unlock the phone, I just take my finger and slide it across. Right? You want to see that again? Go to sleep. We wanted something that you couldn't do by accident in your pocket, and just slide it across. Boom. Well, how do I scroll through my list of artists? How do I do this? I just take my finger and I scroll. That's it. Isn't that cool? A little rubber banding up when I run off the edge. We call it the pinch. I can bring them closer together or move them further apart to make it bigger or smaller. And so I can just move them further apart and stretch the image. cool? And move it around. That's cool.
As Tony Fadell, leader of the iPod phone team, looked on, Steve Jobs did something pretty cruel. When showcasing to the crowd how to delete contact, he gleefully slid Fadell's name off the iPhone contacts list.
Tony's changed his number. I got to update this anyway, so I'm going to get rid of that, and I could just remove Tony. Boom. There we go. It's that simple to edit these things.
He was basically saying to Tony, "You're fired." Scott Forstall states that during rehearsals of the presentation, Steve would always delete a random contact, never Tony's. To the crowd, it was just a demonstration of how this phone made everything fun and cool to use. To those working at Apple, it was a message. Tony was in trouble. In all of this, there was one glaring omission. Wayne Westerman. Onlookers never knew his name, and Wayne wasn't even invited to the event. But without his multi-touch innovation, there would be no iPhone. Instead, on stage, Steve Jobs stated that Apple had invented multi-touch. These events were a summary of how the project had been for most. Brutal. The project was so hard on the secret teams that it ruined marriages and cost some workers their health. Some employees worked every day, giving up their nights and weekends for years at a time. iPhone engineer Andy Grignon speaks, quote, "The iPhone is the reason I'm divorced. It was probably professionally the worst time in my life. You created a pressure cooker with a bunch of really smart people with an impossible deadline, an impossible mission, and then you hear that the future of the entire company is resting on it. There wasn't really any time to kick your feet back on the desk and say, this is going to be really awesome one day. Every time you turned around, there was some just imminent demise of the program just lurking around the corner. It was especially hard on the married guys. There were a lot of divorces. Oblivious to the sacrifice, the world was electric with the buzz of the iPhone.
Oh, that new phone? That new phone that's coming out?
We're going to do that right now. You see, Randy's on top of everything. Here we go. Many people were anticipating the Macworld trade show this week, including Andy, and so far they've not been disappointed. The latest from this show, Apple CEO Steve Jobs unveiling what many are calling a revolutionary new product, the iPhone.
You scroll lists like by flicking like this, and it's like a roulette wheel. It goes stop like that. It's just so cool.
It's very clear to us that the world's going mobile. And we really believe that a device like this, which is, an order of magnitude more powerful than any mobile device or any cell phone that's ever been created, and yet vastly easier to use, is the future.
When it was all said and done, keen fans lined up to get one.
You paid $500 to secure a spot in this line.
No, just come and sit here.
What are you looking forward to using your iPhone for?
Just the fact that I can put all my music and everything on there, and it has a touch screen, and I don't know, I've seen the commercials, it looks really cool.
For me, in 2007, after seeing Jobs' demo of scrolling and gestures, it made sense to me that this was the perfect interface for a small screen device. The iPhone had way more than 1,000 times more computing power than NASA did in 1969 when they put man on the moon. Yet it was super easy to use, with a full web browsing experience to boot. Even children could pick up an iPhone and know what to do. Capacitive multi-touch and gestures had broken down the walls of human-computer interaction. The future had arrived. Finally, a computer in your pocket. As Apple software engineer Henry Lamerix would put it, quote, "We took a Mac and we squished it into a little box," end quote. Other small touches, like a proximity sensor that turned the screen off during a phone call so that it didn't touch your face by accident, and an accelerometer that could sense if you're holding the phone in portrait and landscape, made the whole package feel like magic. Today, it's just so easy to forget just how much of a leap the original iPhone was. What followed the iPhone was a complete shift in how we thought about technology. Now, information and news was instant. We became totally connected all the time. Though in the next decade, this overconnectedness would cause some issues. Once the initial fanfare was over, the sales of the iPhone would be slow. It would take the introduction of the App Store in 2008 to really kick things off again for Apple. If it wasn't for the App Store, the iPhone could have just been one of those devices that looked cool and was cool to use, but never caught on. For an entire year after the iPhone's launch, it could run a grand total of 16 apps. There was only one home screen's worth of apps, and that was it.
And this isn't to mention how limited the iPhone was compared to some other devices out there. It had no multimedia messaging, no video camera, no cut and paste, no 3G, and the list goes on. But that wasn't important. Nokia, BlackBerry, and the rest of the established phone companies had been providing these features for many years. But the difference was, for the first time, a device was now a changeable blank canvas with no buttons. Since the device could run apps on it, the iPhone's software creators could make it whatever they wanted it to be. Their creativity was only limited by their imagination and the hardware capability. Today, billions of apps have been sold, and the mobile app space has become a new industry. Companies like Nokia, BlackBerry, and Palm thought they knew the game, but they couldn't visualize the future. They thought things would never change, and before they realized, it was too late to prosper in this brave new world. Google was working on their own BlackBerry-style phone with a hardware keyboard, but when they saw the iPhone presentation, they abandoned that idea and went for full touchscreen. The result was the very first Android phone. But that's a story for another day. As the years passed, people became less and less excited with each new release of the iPhone. Maybe we've reached a point where the devices are just so good there's only incremental improvements we can make. I asked Ken what he thought of Apple's direction, and he stated that if he was perfectly happy with Apple, he wouldn't have left in 2017, but he hopes that they continue to innovate. As we all know, Apple isn't the only game in town anymore. Competition is much stronger than ever before. Well, maybe the next big thing from Apple is around the corner, but at this stage, only time will tell. The story of the original iPhone is one of great sacrifice, risk, and reward. A story that shaped technology and the world as we know it. It gave the average person an interface to almost infinite information and knowledge, all in the palm of their hand. But sadly, almost nobody knows who invented these technologies and what the cost was to innovate such a device. To finish off, we'll have some words from Ken.
I hope that you all use technology and enjoy it. Some of the products that I made are useful and meaningful to you and bring you some joy in your life. If they do, then I've done my job.
In all of this, something has to be said for Steve Jobs. He may not have invented the technologies, and Ken told me he wasn't the nicest person to work for. But Steve did care about making great products, and he would push people and squeeze the very best out of them to make these products happen. And in that vein, without Steve, there also would be no iPhone. If you've watched this video to the end, thank you, I appreciate it. I hope you can now look down at your iPhone or the other smartphones that followed and appreciate how they came to be. If you want to see more video documentaries from my book, New Thinking, there's a playlist below. If you are new here, you can subscribe so you don't miss out on more videos like this in the future.
Cold fusion. It's new thinking.
Hi, welcome to another Cold Fusion video. HTC holds a very special place in my heart. During my brief stint in tech reviews, I used to review and modify HTC phones while studying at university in 2009. In fact, the very first video that made me consider taking YouTube a bit more seriously featured an HTC phone. It was partly how this channel started. HTC understood design and attention to detail. They reminded me of the old school traditional Apple methodology, but in the Android world. Chances are, if you owned one, you loved it. HTC were a more influential player in the smartphone market than you might think. They made the first ever Android phone. They also designed Google's Nexus devices, and at one point, they were the largest Android phone manufacturer, and the largest smartphone vendor in the United States. Yes, even bigger than Apple. But as of today, their last phone was in May of 2018, and they've completely vanished from the public's consciousness. So how did this happen? Let's go back to a time before Samsung and the plethora of Android devices, a time when the mobile space was very different. Let's see the rise and fall of HTC.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
This is Che Wang. She was born in 1958 in Taiwan and studied in the United States. In 1981, she graduated from the University of California with a bachelor's degree in economics. The next year, she would join the Taiwanese firm First International Computer, and here she learned much about business operations. Many years later, in 1997, Che Wang had the desire to start her own company, and out of this, High Tech Corporation, or HTC, was born. Initially, HTC was a manufacturer of notebook computers, but just a year later, the firm would begin designing some of the world's first touch and wireless handheld devices.
Early in my career, showing off PC motherboard performance to customers all over Europe. Back then, not too many people had a personal computer. Within a few years, most of people has one. While I was dragging my 25-kilo computers up and down a train across Europe, while exhausted, I started to dream about a small computer that fits into my hand that I could use to call my friends or listen to music. As soon as Windows CE came out, I started HTC with my partners to achieve that dream.
A former work colleague of Wang, Peter Chow, took over as CEO in 2004, and from here, HTC started making Windows Mobile PDAs and smartphones. Che Wang would come back later in the story. In 2008, HTC released the world's first device powered by Android, the HTC Dream. In the same year, they would release the first American 4G smartphone, and then they went on to design Google's first hardware phone, the Nexus 1, in 2010. CEO Peter Chow was known for his quick decision-making and also his perfectionist mentality. He would take trays of smartphones at his desk and check every detail. Was the finish on the edges of the phone perfect? Did the joints of the phone line up with precision? Other staff would note that this was obsessive attention to detail. But on the other hand, Peter would criticize management decisions and override them with little discussion. This would later turn out to be a major problem within the walls of HTC. But for now, they were flying high. In November of 2009, the company released the HTC HD2. It was the world's first Windows mobile device with a capacitive touchscreen. Before this, all Windows phones were resistive touch, making them clunky and hard to use. This very phone was the device that started some initial buzz around the Cold Fusion channel. The HTC HD2 phone had a cult following, and some online forums took great interest in the modifications I made to the phone. The resulting video views made me realize that there might be something to this whole YouTube thing. So in a way, I owe something to the company. In 2010, HTC was named one of the most innovative companies in the world. They were definitely a worthy rival for Apple in the United States and Europe. So why were they so successful? Well, the company cared about design, both in hardware and software. Their phones felt premium in your hand. They were well proportioned and designed, often sculpted from unibody brushed aluminium. This was important. It was HTC and not Apple that introduced a unibody metal design. Apple would later copy HTC. Remember, this was at a time when Android smartphones were still plastic. The company was also featuring stereo speakers at a time when sound was an afterthought for many manufacturers. HTC was well ahead of their time in this regard. The attention to detail by CEO Peter Chow was paying off. The second half of the successful design philosophy was in software. Windows Mobile was a big deal in 2009, although the interface was basically an ugly spreadsheet. To address this, HTC created a software skin that ran on top of Windows Mobile called TouchFlow 3D, and it turned the boring spreadsheet look into something engaging and fun. As the world moved from Windows Mobile to Android, the TouchFlow 3D software would turn into HTC Sense, and it did wonders for Android at the time because Android was a mess. HTC Sense cleaned up a lot of the issues and gaps that existed. Users loved it, and the phones gained widespread acclaim. At this point, around 2010, HTC were on top of the world. So how did it go all so wrong? Samsung was looking at what HTC had accomplished, and they decided to make their own themed Android home screen, calling it TouchWiz. The Samsung Galaxy S in 2010 marked this change. Next, Samsung began flooding the market with their devices. HTC and Samsung both began to release phone after phone in a battle for supremacy, but with deeper pockets and better marketing, Samsung's advantage quickly began to show. In 2010 was a pivotal time for the smartphone industry. The general public was beginning to wake up to the fact that smartphones weren't just another PDA. They were actually changing the world. The smartphone boom was just beginning, and as a company, you had two options: hitch a ride or be left behind. Samsung was still largely unknown at the time, but they were coming up fast. If HTC weren't careful, it wouldn't be Apple versus HTC, but Samsung versus Apple. The correct thing for HTC to do would be to double down on mobile, pour money into research and development, advertising, everything and anything to solidify their market position. Instead, they did something bizarre. They lost focus and they invested in unrelated markets. First, the company bought S.i.R Graphics, a PC manufacturer. The deal failed to create any new hardware for HTC phones for their own company or to license to other smartphone makers. HTC then looked to streaming content, investing nearly $90 million in two streaming providers, HOLLiiWOOD and Saffron. Neither venture was fruitful. In 2011, HTC took a 51% stake in Beats Electronics for $300 million. They sold it for a profit of $56 million 2 years later. Just a year later, in 2014, Apple came along and bought Beats for $3 billion. I guess HTC were just trying to make bets to diversify, but all of these ventures ended up failing. While HTC was spinning their wheels, throwing money at things that wouldn't help, Samsung was using its huge manufacturing arsenal. They got to work providing displays and flash memory for both their phones and for other major players, such as Apple's iPhones and even HTC's phones. While Samsung's market share grew, its hold on its competitors also became stronger. The Korean company chipped away at HTC's dominance, bit by bit. Admittedly, these punches would have been difficult for HTC to handle, but it was their next mistake that made things even worse. From 2009 to 2013, HTC centered its marketing strategy around two words: quietly brilliant. The company believed that the quality of their products and the brand would speak for itself. I remember using HTC phones back in the day and thinking that that was true. People just had to use it and then they would love it. Their early phones were second to none, but the thing was, when you asked around, no one really knew who they were. Unfortunately, this would prove to be a big problem. While HTC was being quietly brilliant, Samsung was mocking Apple fans in their advertising. The campaign was a classic and thrust Samsung into the spotlight. It inflamed a war between Apple and Android users so large that it only started to fade just a few years ago. By 2011, HTC's market share had shrunk in half from 67% to 32%, while Samsung's market share grew more than five-fold, from 4% to 27%. In the next year, Samsung was seeing year-over-year growth as high as 300%, and Apple 200%. Meanwhile, HTC was practically standing still. They just had a mere 17% of year-over-year growth. The naming schemes of HTC phones made things even worse. They had wacky names like Cha-Cha, Salsa, Vivid, Velocity, Amaze. They even repeated names like the HTC One, confusing buyers. Is this the new HTC One or the old one? For Samsung at the time, the naming scheme was simple. Their premium phones were just the Galaxy S brand, followed by a number. Despite winning design awards in 2013, the damage had been done for HTC. Within the company, Peter Chow's criticism of managers, along with the hiring of foreign executives, led to morale problems and confusion over responsibility. In 2013, HTC lost their Vice President of Global Communications, Retail Marketing Manager, Director of Digital Marketing, and Product Strategy Manager. Their marketing department was in shambles. There was great upheaval and disarray within the company. Microsoft began to sniff at the crumbling company. They were in negotiations to purchase HTC, but Microsoft would go for Nokia instead. By 2015, Peter had resigned and Che Wang returned as CEO. Things gradually got worse for the company, and in 2015, their share price fell over 60% in that year, and 90% since 2011. It was so low that it fell off the main exchange in Taiwan's stock index. HTC had to cut over 15% of its global workforce as a result. It was during this time that Che Wang knew that the company needed a new direction. So what was she going to do? Smartphones were a thing of the past for them. They needed to think of something new. The answer would be virtual reality headsets. In collaboration with Valve, they would begin manufacturing VR headsets in 2016, and as of today, the headsets seem to be relatively successful in their own right. HTC own about 13% of the VR market. However, in 2017, Google would step in and acquire half of their research and design team for $1.1 billion. In 2018, HTC would lay off a further 22% of their global workforce. Currently, HTC has completely taken their focus away from phones and has shifted to emerging technology, virtual reality, blockchain, artificial intelligence and machine learning, to name a few. It sounds like it's going to be a tough road ahead, but if they can get a strong foothold in the VR space or any one of these spaces, we could see a rise in HTC again. In late 2019, Yves Maïta took over as CEO. He remains optimistic about the future of the company.
In Q2 of this year, HTC posted its 5th consecutive quarterly loss. Last July, there were some pretty large layoffs at the company. I think it was about a quarter of the staff. So my first and I think most important question for you is, why would anyone want to take this job?
That's a good question. If you look at the balance sheet of the company, it's a very strong asset. We have zero debt. We have a lot of assets outside of the brand, outside of the IP, outside of the building. We have 1 billion cash. So yes, it is a challenge, but we have a lot of strengths. And I personally do believe that there is a lot to be done to refresh the company and to make the company being a leading company in the next few months and few years again. I'm strongly believe that there is here a fantastic challenge, and we will get there. You will see, we will get there.
HTC were once the largest smartphone vendor in the United States and the largest Android maker globally. Their fall is almost as impressive as their rise. From weak marketing to poor business moves, to unclear management and confusing naming. The story of HTC can tell us something. In the modern world, which is so noisy and loud, a quiet brand that makes great products isn't enough anymore. If you stand still and think that the quality will speak for itself, the competition will surpass you before you know what's happened. So that's the end of HTC phones. Or is it? Last year, the company stated that they were going to be making a 5G phone, so we're going to have to watch this space. So did you know about HTC? And if so, what was your favorite phone? If you want to see any of my other mini documentaries on smartphones, I've done one on the individuals that actually came up with the ideas that created the iPhone, and another one on the rise and fall of BlackBerry, and one more on the history of Android and iOS. But if you're not interested in that, I have hundreds of videos on this channel that are worth binge watching. So this has been DeGogo, and you've been watching Cold Fusion. I'll see you again soon for the next episode. Cheers guys, have a good one.
Cold Fusion. It's new thinking.
This video is brought to you by Morning Brew. Hi, welcome to today's episode of Cold Fusion. Before I start, this episode isn't a recommendation to buy any of Apple's products. In fact, I'm a Windows and Android user myself. The following is simply my documentation of what I perceive to be the biggest moment in computing history in the last decade or so. I think it's just fascinating. So make sure you're comfortable for this one, get out the popcorn, and be ready to be entertained or learn a thing or two.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
It seems that everyone hates Apple these days, and there's some rationale for that. Recently, they've made their products impossible to repair, increased prices of their products and accessories to a ridiculous level, and enjoy excessive control. But what if Apple actually did something to push the industry forward and spur competition? Well, it turns out that they may just have done that. Phones and computers are never seen as comparable when it comes to power. They both live in different worlds. Though, as long-time subscribers would know, back in 2012, I was comparing the two of them and seeing if a phone could replace a PC. The rate at which phone power was improving year over year was absolutely unbelievable to me at the time. Those were some fun days. The main difference between phones and desktop computers is that they use different types of processor technology. Phones use a type of processor design called ARM, while desktop computers generally use another type called x86, like Intel for example. ARM is a simpler design than x86, making it more efficient, but x86 traditionally used to be able to do more, but this is changing. The interesting thing to note is that in recent years, our phones have been getting faster at a much more rapid rate than computers have been improving. So here's a question. What happens when the chips in our phones come close to the power of laptop and desktop computers? What if you took this amazing performance and efficiency of a mobile chip and put it in the body of a laptop? That is, access to a larger battery and more space to breathe. Well, things that many thought were impossible begin to happen.
And then I didn't plug it in for 4 days, totaling a little over 10 hours of mixed use, and still had 17% less. Animations are buttery smooth as you'd expect, and even opening and closing some of those bigger apps like Chrome and Lightroom are just as fast, if not faster, than on my desktop, which is sick. It's just an overall really responsive feel.
Okay, look at this guy. Okay, Angelica, when you're editing this, show the footage from the Surface Pro X. How that was. The Windows version of this, there was extreme lag moving and doing anything, and here it is extremely smooth. And this is the base model MacBook Air without a fan.
These M1 Macs are setting up the future of Mac hardware as we know it. It is changing everything.
The new MacBooks and the M1 chip that powers it resulted in an energy-efficient chip as powerful as some desktop CPUs. What most people are missing is that this isn't an ordinary MacBook. The M1 chip represents the culmination of a decade of planning and a radical shift in the consumer computing industry. On the surface, putting a mobile chip in Apple's best-selling computer seems really stupid, but when you look deeper, it makes a whole lot of sense. As you'll see later, it's actually a classic case of disruption, as defined by Clay Christensen in 1997. So how did Apple do this? Well, the journey of how Apple got to this point will be the subject of today's episode. You'll also see how Intel's CEO refused to work on the iPhone and made one of the biggest mistakes in tech history. To truly understand what Apple has done, we first must go through some quick history. Central Processing Units, or CPUs, are the brain of computers. They do all the billions of calculations a second to make our devices run. CPUs run on what are called instructions. These are the fundamental tiny bits of data that tell our computers what to do. For example, add these two numbers together, fetch this number from memory, that kind of thing. When you group these commands together, they're called an instruction set. In the emerging battle between mobile and desktop CPUs, it would be the variations in how these instruction sets were handled that would make all the difference. Since its founding in 1968 by Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, Intel has been the gatekeeper of mainstream computer CPUs. They would gain the name x86 after a series of popular chips in the late 70s and early 80s that ended in the number 86. The x86 instruction set architecture would go on to dominate the industry. From the 1980s, chip manufacturers would begin to add more and more complicated instructions to be perceived as better to a non-suspecting buyer. Over time, these instructions made the chip's functionality bloated. Precious and limited physical space on the chip was being taken up by fancy instructions that were hardly ever used by the rest of the system. Meanwhile, in the UK, in 1983, a company by the name of Acorn Computers decided to go down a different path. Instead of making things more and more complicated, why not take a simpler approach? This mode of thinking was called RISC, or Reduced Instruction Set Computing, as opposed to the bloated CISC from companies like Intel.
Some people are saying RISC technology is the wave of the future. Other people are saying RISC is already a passé technology. What does this expert think?
Well, Stuart, the current IBM PC line that they're based upon a processor called the 8086. It's kind of a messy architecture. So RISC gives us as a new starting point. We can say, okay, here's a simpler instruction set, faster, less code space. Well, if you talk about RISC, is that a philosophy, a way you design a machine architecture, or is it a specific set of instructions?
No, it certainly is a philosophy or a style, and in fact, it's a style which differs depending on what you're trying to do. The main idea is not to add any complexity to the machine unless it pays for itself by how frequently you would use it.
Out of this came the Acorn RISC Machine project, otherwise known as ARM. This was the birth of the type of chips that would be used in all of our smartphones in the coming decades. So in this episode, for simplicity's sake, we'll just refer to RISC chips as simplified CPUs, and CISC chips as complex CPUs. While developing the first ARM chip, during testing, something unexpected happened. Here Professor Steve Ferber speaks about how he started the ARM project.
As we set about designing the ARM, we didn't really expect to pull it off, okay? Firstly, we thought this RISC idea is so obvious that big industry will pick up on it and we'll get trampled underfoot. We expected to go into this project finding out why it wasn't a good idea to do it. And the obstacle just never emerged from the mist. We just kept moving forward through the fog until eventually we had a fully working ARM chip in our hands. I don't think it was day one, but a few days later we decided we better measure the power consumption. So I turned the ARM chip on, ran some code on it, looked at the ammeter, and it was reading 0. And I knew we'd designed a fairly low power chip, but this was a bit remarkable. And it turned out that actually in inserting the ammeter into the power supply, I'd failed to connect the power supply. So no current was flowing through the ammeter, but the chip was still running.
So hang on, so it wasn't just you didn't connect the ammeter, it was actually that you didn't connect the chip to the power supply?
Yes,
right?
There was no power supply connection to the chip.
And yet it was
running.
By 1985, they had their first prototype, and by 1987, the first computer based on ARM was produced, the Acorn Archimedes. And from here, ARM would license its designs to other manufacturers for them to build. At first, being low power was a nice side effect, but it didn't have much of an advantage for desktop machines. But as portable computing devices started showing up, ARM became the first choice. They were used in everything from Nokias to Ericsson phones. So, how were these ARM chips so efficient? When we talk about computer CPUs, we measure them in gigahertz, and that means clock cycles per second. Simplified CPUs, such as ARM, generally will do one simple instruction per clock cycle, while desktop chips may use many cycles to complete one complex instruction. This means more power consumption, less efficiency, and more heat produced. Multiply this by hundreds of millions of times a second, and the issue starts to become clear. In some desktop CPUs, some of the complex instructions can take a dozen clock cycles or more to complete. Though, contrary to popular belief, both kinds of processors were flourishing during the 1990s. In the early days, simple instruction set designs were great for engineering and graphics, so much so that computers using the technology helped create films such as Jurassic Park, Toy Story, and more. Simple instruction CPUs were also used in the 3D graphics chip of the Nintendo 64 and other early game consoles, but the desktop market safely belonged to Intel.
This symbol outside says inside you'll find a legacy of technological leadership. The Intel Pentium processor for the next generation of compatible power. That's Intel, the computer inside.
In 1991, Apple, IBM, and Motorola combined forces to create the PowerPC chip. Interestingly, PowerPC was a desktop chip, but used simple instruction sets. Apple would proudly put them in their computers during the 90s. The simple instruction ARM CPU would get a huge boost in the form of the iPod in 2001. Apple's use of the ARM chip in the iPod was a microcosm for ARM's popularity in portable devices. From mobile phones to MP3 players, by 2002, there were 1 billion ARM chips in devices. Despite using ARM simple CPUs in their portable devices, Apple's PowerPC collaboration with IBM and Motorola wasn't going so well. Their simple CPUs were falling behind Intel. It was looking like Intel and their complex CPU way of thinking was the way to go for the desktop market, so Apple left PowerPC behind.
And yes, it's true. We are going to begin the transition from the PowerPC to Intel processors.
When Intel signed the deal with Apple in 2005, Apple was already thinking of what comes next. They went to Intel to see if they could power the upcoming iPhone. Now, at this time, a moment occurred that Intel would never forget. Paul Otellini, CEO of Intel at the time, didn't see such a deal working out, as it was far outside their speciality. He didn't believe that Intel could earn enough money by building mobile chips for Apple's new iPhone. Revenue wasn't going to cover the research costs, or so he thought. He couldn't imagine the iPhone selling well. This obviously proved to be a huge missed opportunity. The iPhone launched in 2007 using a simple instruction ARM CPU. If Intel's CEO, Paul Otellini, had made the deal happen, they would have had a massive stake in the iPhone business. But unfortunately for Intel, Apple was moving on without them. In 2008, Apple would sign an architecture license with ARM. This was so they could design their own chips from the ground up. They would also buy PA Semi, a company whose founder previously specialized in high-performance ARM chip development. This was a key strategic acquisition for Apple. It gave them the expertise and potential to design some of the best ARM chips, and it put them on the road to disrupt Intel and their x86 processors. In 2012, Apple releases their first fully custom designed CPU. It would be codenamed Swift and was used in the iPhone 5. This was in contrast to using off-the-shelf designs from ARM, as it had previously done. This new Apple-built chip was 2 times as fast as the previous chip. Even for being a first-generation chip, it had impressive performance when compared to the mobile competition, but it wasn't head-turning. The real shock to the industry came the next year in 2013 with the Apple A7 in the iPhone 5S. Apple's early adoption of a 64-bit architecture stunned everybody. They even beat ARM's own CPU teams by more than a year. ARM's own 64-bit design wouldn't be seen until late 2014 in the form of the Galaxy S4. Apple famously called their 2013 chip design, quote, desktop-class architecture. Most people thought it was just Apple bragging, but this wording actually was a hidden clue as to where the company was heading. As you'll soon see, their latest custom chip does actually hold up with desktop PCs. By 2014, there were 50 billion ARM chips in the world. All the while, Apple kept selling a bunch of iPhones and making a heap of money. And do you know what all of this revenue can buy? A ton of R&D. The chips inside of the iPhone kept evolving and improving, getting faster while using less power. By the end of 2018, with Apple's A12 chip, it was looking like Apple was catching up to Intel. In this chart, the grey dots are Apple and the blue squares are Intel. In the past 5 years, Intel managed to increase their flagship performance by about 28%. In the same time, Apple managed to improve their designs by 300%. And this is where things start getting very strange. The Intel chip at the top of this chart, the Core i9-10900K, is a desktop chip that uses 125 watts of power. It's the kind that you have to plug into a wall. Meanwhile, Apple's A14 chip in the iPhone 12, the one in the top right hand corner that performs better than the chip I just mentioned, uses 5 watts and is powered by a phone battery. YouTuber Jonathan Morrison does a test of exporting a heavy-duty video file on a desktop versus an iPhone 12.
Check this out. This is a fairly capable machine. It's got 10 cores, got a beefy GPU, and what I have here is Sony FX9 HDR 10-bit footage. We're gonna start that. I'm gonna throw this open. We're gonna see a couple things, right? We're gonna see the CPU cores just spike up, and you should start hearing the fans. Now, in the meantime, while this thing is chugging along, I have the iPhone 12 mini, little guy. Keep in mind, this thing is still slowly chugging along. I'm gonna open up iMovie, create a movie. The first thing you notice is just the scrubbing in the playback, right? So this is a fanless, teeny tiny iPhone 12 and just butter. So what I'm gonna do is take that, export, make sure we're in 4K, on 20% battery, HDR. Keep in mind, this thing's still going. It's got a nice little head start, right? So this is on a battery, about 20% left, no fan, and this is a decked out iMac.
The thing to note here is that the iPhone chip does have hardware acceleration, but it can be argued that this is just a smarter way of doing things anyway. The M1 chip is even faster than this. Looking at this, and the speed at which Apple's chip performance was accelerating, Apple pretty much was forced to ditch Intel and their x86 platform. Intel was just too slow to innovate. They were struggling to keep up with the manufacturing technology, whereas Apple could outsource manufacturing of their custom ARM designs to others like Samsung. The performance lead of Intel's desktop CPUs were being evaporated right in front of everyone's eyes. By 2019, the iPad was more powerful than the Intel MacBook Pro of the previous year. This is something I mentioned in a previous episode. The speed of all of these advancements would come back to shock people in 2020. If you're interested in this episode so far, you might be keen on some more tech news from today's sponsor, Morning Brew. Apple has announced that from the 1st of January, they'll be lowering their App Store fees from 30% to 15%. This is in response to the antitrust allegations from the United States and EU. Apple has also agreed to pay $113 million for its scandal in slowing down old iPhones to make their batteries last longer. That's chump change if you ask me. I came to know these stories through Morning Brew, a great way to catch up on news in the morning. You can get up to speed in just 5 minutes instead of wasting time going to different sources. It's informative and makes news less dry and boring. It gets sent to your inbox each weekday and Saturday, and it's free, so there's no reason not to subscribe to Morning Brew if you're interested in business, finance, or tech. Click the link in the description below to sign up to Morning Brew. It only takes 15 seconds. Alright, so where were we? ARM chips are being used for low power uses, like in mobile phones. Intel refused to make chips for the iPhone, and then Apple decided to do it themselves by acquiring a company. And then with this expertise, Apple has pushed the state of the art forward until mobile phone chips were comparable to PCs. And now it was time for ARM and Apple to take on the PC head on. In November of 2020, Apple reveals its new processor to take on the PC. It's called the M1, the company's first custom CPU designed with Macs in mind. It features 16 billion transistors, 35% more than the A14 inside the new iPhone 12. And because it's ARM-based and shares the same DNA as the iPhone, the new MacBook can run iPad and iPhone apps, all with transistors on a 5nm process. Early testing of the chip is blowing the online tech reviewer community off their feet.
Proceeded to annihilate the other tests, posting 1744 on single core, which is faster than every Intel Mac ever made.
Now, Vadim really wants to jump in front of the camera and give his opinion.
All right, so I have a 2018 base 15-inch MacBook Pro. I tried playing League of Legends. It's not smooth, it's glitchy, you get drop frames, and I'm just blown away that we're getting native resolution, everything maxed out, getting around 60 FPS.
And you have a dedicated graphics card in that laptop.
Yes, it has a dedicated chip, and this is under Rosetta.
Not even optimized.
It's not even optimized for Apple Silicon.
These are legit. This is super fast, to the point where I had a friend, he actually makes an app, a pretty well-known app. He uses a Hackintosh 3950X, 16 core, really decked out system specifically for development, right? This is his build time. Somehow these M1 devices are keeping up. One of them being fanless. It's pretty crazy. And this was the moment, like when I got the numbers back, I was like, this is real. Apple Silicon is real.
If Apple as a company is to continue on their current performance trajectory, it's going to be insane to see. Here's a quote from AnandaTech. Quote, Apple claims the M1 to be the fastest CPU in the world. Given our data on the older A14 beating all of Intel's designs and just falling short of AMD's newest Zen 3 chips, we can certainly believe that Apple and the M1 will be able to achieve that claim. AMD has shown lots of progress lately. However, it'll be incredibly hard to catch up with Apple's power efficiency. If Apple's performance trajectory continues at this pace, the x86 performance crown might never be regained. End quote. When you're aware of the wider applications of ARM in the real world, it was only a matter of time. The fastest supercomputer in the world, the Japanese Fugaku, is 3 times faster than IBM's, and it uses ARM architecture. Though this is the clincher, needing a more powerful computer isn't relevant to everyone, but having more efficiency and less power consumption is, and it's something that everyone can notice. Clay Christensen, who wrote the book Innovator's Dilemma in 1997, states that disruptive innovations, quote, involve no new technologies. Rather, they consist of components built around proven technologies that are put together in novel architectures, offering the consumer a set of attributes never before available. And he goes on, they are, quote, initially used only by the unsophisticated consumers at the low end of markets. So, ARM chips have existed since the 1980s. But in the current day, they've traditionally only been used for lower end items, like smartphones for example. Though putting ARM chips in a laptop has existed for a long time, Windows has done this for years, but having an ARM chip that is so powerful that it can reach the top end of the consumer computer market is new. Christensen, who wrote this quote, shows a chart of disruptive technologies 25 years ago. Look carefully at this. What does it look like? Steve Jobs even had something to say about this. Speaking at the launch of his next computer, he said that all systems and architectures have about 10 years of life. At the start, you have to get people to build applications for it, and around year 5, it reaches its architectural peak. Quote, then it goes on what you might call a glide slope. The architecture is everything it's going to ever be at that point. So what about program compatibility? Well, according to early reviews, the CPU is so powerful that it has similar or better performance running apps that weren't even designed for it. According to The Verge, it's so good that they couldn't even tell if the apps running were coded for ARM or not. So, in conclusion, despite no upgradable RAM, a hefty upgrade price, and no external GPU support, the big story here is the chip architecture and nothing else. It's proving that ARM can have an inherent advantage in the laptop and desktop space. This moment was decades in the making, and I feel honoured to have been around to witness it. Things are going to get super interesting from here on out, and I can only hope that competition arises from this moment. This is so us as consumers can win. Though it's strange how there are those out there who get upset over this. Can't we just enjoy the progress that's being made instead of ridiculing each other over our technology preferences? I'm just happy that the technology is moving and competition may come from it. This performance increase is the biggest gap that we've seen in many, many years, and I think it's awesome. And that's the end of the story. So thanks for watching. Are you guys excited for future laptops that have extremely long battery life and have the CPU power of desktops? These kinds of machines could be less expensive and do wonders for students and professionals alike. Anyway, that's it from me. I do want to make a quick mention that I've got some new merch just in time for the holiday season, so if you're feeling festive, you can pick some up in the description below. Anyway, my name is Dagogo, and you've been watching Cold Fusion, and I'll catch you again soon for the next episode. Cheers guys. Have a good one.
Cold Fusion. It's new thinking.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Cold Fusion. Only a couple of years ago, China was on the path to overtaking the United States and becoming the world's largest economy. In 2014, many were speculating that this could happen as soon as 2024. Dubbed by many as an economic miracle, China grew from a third world country to a global superpower in just a matter of a few decades. Few could foresee the effects that the economic reform in the late 1970s would have on the developing country. Soon, the lists of the largest companies in the world began to feature more and more Chinese enterprises. Globally, the country was one of the most important trade partners, fueling globalization on a scale never seen before. And with that power came influence. Fast forward a few years, and China finds itself in a myriad of problems, both economic and political. A catastrophic zero-COVID policy, real estate debt crisis, external infrastructure issues, internal debt issues, a mini revolt of the youth, and the slowing down of the economy are just some of the things that have been plaguing the nation recently. The results of these issues threaten the very power structures of the country. So how did China get here, and what are the consequences for the country and the world as a whole? So get comfortable, buckle up, and get ready for a wild ride.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
Let's begin by understanding the most talked about issue, the real estate bubble. The main growth, both for the Chinese economy as well as the housing market, began in 1979 with economic reform. From here, China opened up to the rest of the world. Massive civilian migration from rural locations to main city hubs ensued as people looked to improve their quality of life.
Hundreds of millions of sons, and particularly daughters, of Chinese farmers who moved from the farm where they were earning really the same as they were earning 1,000 years ago in Chinese history, absolute subsistence wages. They traveled 4 or 5 hours to the local city, and there they began working in the big factories, the workshop of the world.
Due to that, in 4 decades, China went from a mostly rural population to a country where 2/3 of the entire population lives in major city hubs. On top of relocations, a cultural element also boosted the sales of housing. Owning real estate was considered a source of financial stability for a family, as well as a prerequisite for marriage.
As a result of the one-child policy and the Chinese preferring male heirs, there are 35 million more men than women in China. That creates intense competition for brides, with men often having to prove their material worth. This often means owning a home.
This led to entire families and their friends pooling money to contribute to the purchase of a house for their relatives. Why, you might ask? Because the prices of apartments have gotten so out of control that, according to the Financial Times, housing affordability in China is among the worst in the world. Taking into account living expenses, it would take the average earner 50 years to buy an apartment. This collective pooling of money is a major difference between the Chinese property market and the West. Little inventory and slow development combined with rapid growth led to major supply issues. Thus, prices rose and affordable housing became an issue for local governments. The solution was to issue loans to property development companies, as well as easing the credit lending standards to individuals. Due to these factors, the Chinese real estate market became a rocket ship, and it fueled massive economic growth. Some companies, like the infamous Evergrande, took full advantage of this situation and expanded aggressively, aided in a large part by the availability of cheap credit. Evergrande became so large that they even built a theme park and purchased a soccer team with some of the money. The theme park is now abandoned. You'll see why shortly, but here's how it looks like now. It really is a sad waste of money, time, and resources. Many of these property institutions quickly became the largest in the country, and many expanded projects into overseas markets. Commercial housing sales reached $2.7 trillion in 2020. In China today, the general population has about 70% of their total wealth stored in the real estate market. Let me repeat that. 70% of their total wealth is stored in the real estate market. However, the supply of housing was still short, in part due to speculation. It was commonplace to purchase a second or third home as an investment, since it was considered wise and a stable use of savings. Seeing the never-ending demand, developers created an ingenious system to further fuel expansion. These were based on two key pillars. First, they started to finance their operations with foreign debt. The appetite for Chinese debt and equity was increasing around the world since their massive growth brought very attractive yields. Secondly, developers created pre-sale options for buyers that quickly became the norm in the country. In it, home buyers would give money to developers for a home that has yet to be built. All they had was a promise that once it was finished, it would be theirs.
The whole construction period would take about 2 to 3 years usually, and people will start paying their mortgage way before the completion of the project.
We're talking about months or
years, even years, maybe over a year and a half. In the past, it wasn't seen as a risky business because, as I said, and people would not expect developers cannot complete their home at a large scale, not like now.
While this made sense for both sides, it quickly escalated. With loose regulations around how much money the property developers needed to keep, they started to game the system to their advantage. By obtaining pre-sales, they were able to start new projects without finishing the old ones. Once the new projects yielded new pre-sales, they would use some of that money to finance the actual construction, while the rest went to new projects, and so on. In essence, they created a Ponzi scheme that relied 100% on the stable and perpetual growth of the housing market. However, once the influx of people to major cities started to slow down, from 4.1% in 1996 to 2.1% in 2020, the scheme started to fall apart. With a slowdown in pre-sales, developers started to rely more and more on banks and foreign debt to keep expanding. Sometimes the debt payment was too large to pay with an operating income, so they used further debt to finance their obligations. It all continued for some time, but soon the Chinese authorities ended the scheme. In August of 2020, the Chinese government implemented the 3 red lines policy. Each line represents a debt ratio that the companies had to respect. If not, their ability to contract more liabilities was severely hampered. Developers with extreme amounts of debt, such as Evergrande, crossed all 3 lines, meaning that they were not able to increase their liabilities any further. And since Evergrande used debt to finance old liabilities, it was not long before they started to run into liquidity troubles. First, they failed to repay the wealth managers who had a direct investment in the company, and this provoked a large revolt by wealth managers and investors who went to their headquarters to protest.
In September 2021, there was a hugely crucial moment.
Evergrande missed payments on wealth management products. The wealth management market in China is where ordinary people can put their savings, and the money is usually going into real estate, often to companies like Evergrande. And these people who had invested hadn't got their money back. They descended on the headquarters of Evergrande in Shenzhen.
We don't know where to get our money. And now we go to Shenzhen government and nobody help us.
This was the point at which it went from it might be a crisis to, well, it probably is a crisis.
Soon after, Evergrande started to fail on its payments of dollar bonds, and these bonds were sold to the Western world. And they weren't the only property company in trouble. Property developer S.i.R missed a $400 million bond payment in November of 2021. And in January of 2022, Shimao Group defaulted on a $101 million loan. And most recently, Yuzo Group requested to defer a payment of offshore bonds worth $582 million. This resulted in a large loss of confidence in the Chinese housing and bond market, both internally and externally. This culminated in mortgage strikes by distinguished buyers who were paying their monthly bills without seeing any progress on their purchased property. To date, more than 320 groups of homeowners are believed to be refusing to pay their mortgage loans.
Anger erupting among Chinese home buyers as property developers hold construction on their homes.
这种希望破灭的那种感觉，就有点万念俱灰了。
Since July, homebuyers in over 100 cities across China have declared a mortgage boycott. Just like Tian, many homebuyers are desperate. Some have taken to street demonstrations, but these have been quickly quashed, with officials citing COVID concerns. Backed into a corner, homebuyers have threatened to stop payments on their mortgage in over 300 projects.
The value of these loans is estimated to be worth between $150 and $300 billion. The Chinese government has since slightly relaxed the rules. And, on top of that, the Chinese central bank has cut interest rates in an attempt to revive the credit and housing markets. We'll have to see what happens with this. It's not clear if the situation will subside or if more property developers go insolvent, causing civil unrest. On top of all of this, real estate-related activities represent close to 30% of total Chinese yearly GDP. If the property sectors go under, there's going to be a ripple effect. It's a risk to banks, local governments, and the stability of China. While all of that might sound bad enough, other debt issues are starting to rear their ugly head. There's been many unprofitable and huge debt-ridden infrastructure projects. One famous case is the Super-Speed Railroad. The infrastructure project began after the 2008 financial crisis as an attempt to pump money into the economy and create employment opportunities. It was a classic fiscal policy boost that worked to perfection. The project was a major success, offering employment to millions, and single-handedly pushed some industry sectors, such as steel and concrete, out of default. This was, in large part, why China avoided the turmoil that most other countries faced during the 2008 crisis. While it did save the economy from recession, the problems started right after construction finished. Since the railway connected secondary locations and not main destinations, the demand was not always there. And to add to this, the ticket prices were out of reach for the majority of the population. The lack of revenue may not have been an issue. However, this project was funded by massive amounts of debt by major banks, local governments, as well as some publicly issued bonds. From 2015 up to this day, the interest alone on these payments have surpassed the operating income of the project. That's right, the interest on the debt has been more than the company's income. As of 2021, their total liabilities are 5.9 trillion yuan, or $900 billion. In other words, 5% of the Chinese GDP. The majority of these liabilities are bonds, which are sold to state banks. Thanks to the zero-COVID lockdowns, the rail infrastructure is being used even less. As a response, the Chinese government announced an economic stimulus to lift the COVID-hit economy. This included allowing the China Railway to issue another 300 billion yuan in the form of railway construction bonds. They're doubling down on an already unprofitable venture. It seems like China is putting appearances above functionality and profitability, a path that can lead to major issues if not addressed accordingly. Due to massive amounts of debt expansion, profit motives, and poor planning, there are numerous ghost cities in China. These are areas of vast amounts of infrastructure and property that virtually remains unoccupied. The Financial Times explains.
The ratio of empty apartments in China could range between 10% and as high as 40 or even 50% in some small cities.
There are enough empty homes in China right now to house about 90 million people, greater than the population of Germany or the UK.
Newer developments were built quite quickly without a lot of consideration for, the logistics.
I've traveled to many parts of China where you go to a suburb and suddenly you see this forest of apartment blocks. Carry on for 5-10 minutes in your taxi and you're still going through apartment block after apartment block with nobody in them.
I visited one of the more famous ghost cities, Ordos, in the middle of the desert, very far away from anything. It was quite strange because it's not like there's necessarily jobs there.
To add to the internal debt issues, China is also struggling with external infrastructure projects. The Grand Belt and Road Initiative is threatening to turn out to be one of the most unprofitable global projects of all time. The initiative is a large investment into more than 100 countries. It's China's ambitious attempt at growing global influence as well as creating global links to China, in theory strengthening its import-export markets. The thing is though, investment in risky countries is just that, risky, and if not calculated properly, these investments can turn out to be very unprofitable ventures. In just 2020 and 2021, China has had to renegotiate more than $52 billion in debt, and a lot of the countries that China deals with are unwilling or unable to pay. The Belt and Road Initiative has become so large that China has become the world's largest source of development credit, overtaking the World Bank as well as the IMF. Considering that this project is political in nature, no matter how unprofitable, the state government is likely to keep financing it. China could gain untold geopolitical leverage, but it comes with the risk of a catastrophic outcome, both for the financial stability of China, as well as causing a political debacle due to its involvement in other countries' foreign affairs. As if debt issues, both on the internal and external front, are not enough, the Chinese government continues to support a zero-COVID policy to this day. The plan on paper was to eliminate the disease. The government was to be seen as competent and to be able to deal with whatever came its way, and it worked for some time. As of today, according to the official statistics, the death toll from the virus in China stands at a little over 5,000, while the US is over 1 million. No matter how staged these numbers might be, the authorities could point to this low number as a rationale for lockdowns. While the rest of the world is moving on due to herd immunity, China, on the other hand, can't do so. They've had no natural immunity.
The latest mandate is for every major city to have a test site like this within 15 minutes walk of every resident. It looks like they're going to become a permanent fixture on the streets, and having a negative result will be required for going to school, work, shopping, or eating out.
There will be no living with the virus in China. It is pursuing a pandemic victory at all costs.
Once they announced the zero-COVID policy and how it could go on for more than 5 years, the lockdown's perception in the general population's eyes quickly changed. People are now protesting lockdowns in what can only be described as a dystopian nightmare. However, even if the state wanted to, going back on its policies now would be a complete disaster, both on a humanitarian and political scale. According to Shanghai's Fudan University, the death toll could reach more than 1 million people, and it would be an admission of failure on the part of state leadership. Completely unacceptable, as the government is preparing for its 20th Party Congress, where current President Xi Jinping will go on for his 3rd consecutive term as party leader. Thus, having a slowdown of the economy and popular discontent seem to be, no matter how wrong, the only viable path for the state authorities moving forward. If they backtrack, it's weakness. And saving face is a big part of Chinese culture, and the government must showcase their superiority, no matter how staged it might seem to their Western counterparts. What does this mean for the economy? Well, to start, a massive decline in internal demand, and increasing employment, especially among the young. For educated young people, 1/5 of themselves find themselves jobless at the time of recording. On the external front, the zero-COVID policy has been one of the main issues feeding into the global recession. There's been a weakening of confidence of foreign businesses that rely on China for exports and imports. The most extreme example is Apple, who is moving some of their manufacturing of the iPhone 14 to rival India, and we've done a full episode on this story. The economic and political issues are not the only problems for the state government either. Increasing unemployment among the young and educated is quickly on the rise, climbing to a record 20% in July of this year. This is mainly due to the slowing down of the economy and the shrinking opportunities that come with it. In my 2021 episode on the Great Resignation, we touched on the popular online movement called Tang Ping, or Lie Flat. Basically, it was an online movement of youth that decided to stop playing the rat race, stop climbing that corporate ladder, and just to take things more slowly. But now, in 2022, this has evolved into something new, a more extreme movement known as Bai Lan, or to let it rot. These youth have completely decided to give up on the system and are just doing the bare minimum to get by. It's a complete shock to the older generation of Chinese who have never seen anything like this in their lifetime. The Bailan youth believe that there's nothing to be gained by working hard, and putting in extra effort isn't going to result in reward. It didn't take long for the Chinese government to take notice. In May of 2022, President Xi Jinping, in a speech to the entire nation, emphasized the importance of young people and their contributions to the country as a whole, stating that, quote, "China's hopes lie in youth." Reducing inequality and improving opportunities has been their main priority for some time, and yet the measures taken, such as cracking down on big tech and banning private school tutoring, so far have not helped the situation much. So the preceding was a brief summary of what's been going on in China. There was plenty that wasn't said. We didn't even get to the rural bank runs, where around 400,000 people aren't able to access their life savings. But you get the idea. So, are the clickbait titles on YouTube true? Is China going to implode? Well, the answer is more complicated than that. It seems clear that China is putting its political agenda in front of economic and humanitarian situations. The stubbornness of the ruling class has caused China to be in an uncomfortable position. A seemingly unstoppable nation suddenly has major cracks appearing in multiple places, cracks that need to be patched with more than a band-aid solution. The major thread across all of these topics covered is a loss of confidence by its people in the state government, and getting that confidence back will be a difficult challenge. Perhaps the most likely outcome may be a slow grinding recession and political upheaval in the coming years. But ultimately, it's too complicated of an analysis for anyone to give a definite answer. But there's definitely more work that needs to be done to keep things from escalating further and for the people to trust their government again. One thing is sure, the next few years for China carry a lot of risk, and whether things get a lot worse or not depends on how the situation is handled by the Chinese government. But what about the rest of the world? Well, for the rest of the world, these problems in China will certainly have major ripple effects, especially for those who rely directly on the import-export market of China. We can expect the inflationary trend to continue as Chinese supply diminishes. For the United States, this means 20% of their total imports can be affected. On top of that, the growing deglobalization trend will make prices higher as more countries bet on local production, and that means less cheap labor. For some economies like Australia, where I'm from, we might be in a lot of trouble because Australia's exports to China account for about 65% of total trade. That's a massive exposure risk, and as most Australians would know, we don't really have that many other trading partners that could back up such a loss. Specific industries will also see major setbacks. Case in point is the EV battery sector. The Chinese lithium-ion global battery production was 76%. While there are constant efforts by the European and US governments to increase their production, the stark truth is that China is a massive trading partner that can't be replaced on short notice. Lastly, it's also important to mention the investment exposure that many countries have to Chinese debt and equities. This includes many investment firms in Europe and the US, not to mention all the funds that have suffered losses from the numerous delisting of Chinese equities over the past few months. On top of that, China's slowdown could mean more difficulty for the US to issue debt, since China is the second largest holder of US treasuries. On the positive side, less demand for fuel. China imports 80% of its needs, and it's going to put some downward pressure on prices, giving a little help to the energy crisis now, and a small downward force on the input costs on basically every good produced. Overall, the interconnectedness between global markets has been the engine of growth for some time, both an Achilles heel and the key to economic prosperity of this century. A recession in one major economy means a global slowdown for the rest of the world. It will be very interesting to witness the changes that happen. Will this change global trading in the future? Will globalization continue to be a trend? Or after this, will countries tend to look more inward, and will production be more localized? Whether it's the outlook of China or the global economy as a whole, only time will tell. So what do you guys think? Feel free to discuss in the comment section below. Before I go, just one final note. In the last episode about the UK economy, there were a lot of comments gloating about the situation and rejoicing. I think it's worth noting that a distinction should be made between a nation's government and the innocent civilians who don't deserve to suffer when things start going wrong. This also applies to the citizens of China. It's never nice to see innocent people suffer. I just thought I'd make that clear. If you did like this episode, feel free to take a look around the channel. There's plenty of interesting topics here on Cold Fusion, whether you're into science, technology, or business and finance. Anyway, thanks for watching. My name is Dagogo, and you've been watching Cold Fusion, and I'll see you again soon for the next episode. Cheers guys, have a good one.
Cold fusion. It's new thinking.
This has been a disaster in slow motion. Almost everybody saw it coming. Lebanon's politicians have simply stood by and watched their country slip into the abyss.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Cold Fusion. Rising inflation, stagnant wages, and a sluggish economy is the story of a lot of countries today. But the story of Lebanon depicts a collapse of a different magnitude. Currently, it's facing arguably the worst economic crisis the world has seen in 150 years. More than 80% of its population lives below the poverty line. Prices are spiraling out of control, and the national currency is in freefall, losing more than 97% of its value. But it's not all about economic figures and data. It's a human tragedy. Millions of people are losing everything they have. It's a sad tale of frustration, a sense of betrayal, and a pervasive exhaustion with never-ending corruption and mismanagement within its government. Families are sending children to orphanages simply because they can't afford to feed them. Citizens have resorted to robbing banks, not to get other people's money, but to get back their own. Meanwhile, the banks have smuggled over $6 billion out of the country, and the bankers themselves are buying multi-million-dollar properties in New York. What makes this so shocking is that if you go back just a couple of years, you could not predict just how deep this crisis would reach. Back then, Lebanon was doing much better than their regional peers, boasting one of the largest GDPs per capita in the Middle East. Its tourism sector thrived, and its banking system was an ironclad vault. It was called the Switzerland of the Middle East. But just a few years later, it was all decimated. So what triggered this rapid decline, and what are the consequences echoing today? And more importantly, is there a light at the end of this very dark tunnel? Buckle up as we embark on a deep dive into the story of Lebanon and its struggle for survival.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
To fully grasp the Lebanon crisis, we must travel back to 1975. At the time, Lebanon was in the midst of a civil war between the Christians and Muslims, a feud that permeated every level of society. For 15 long years, the war raged, taking a devastating toll of 120,000 lives. The conflict finally ceased in 1989, when representatives from each faction agreed to sit down and hash out a deal. The outcome? A sectarian government that promised a slice of the political pie to each religious faction. In this political landscape, each religious group would have representation in the nation's parliament, and political parties would form around religious lines. Each sect would also claim different ministries, essentially dividing the government into fiefdoms. The thing was, this arrangement was supposed to be a temporary 3-year fix, a stepping stone to a more stable, non-sectarian system. But the transition never happened, and this divide can be considered the root cause of all the issues that began to ensue in the following decades. This separation just happened to be the perfect breeding ground for politicians to put their own people in power and fill their own pockets in the process. So after this civil war, Lebanon was in ruins and in need of rebuilding. Due to some sense of political stability, capital started to flow into the country. The government capitalized on foreign aid and created more incentives for foreign investment. Soon the country began to blossom. Between 1990 and the year 2000, Lebanon's GDP surged by an impressive 400%. About 60% of the country's GDP came from trade, tourism, and financial services. And also, those who were Lebanese and living overseas tended to send a lot of money back home. Given the service-centric economy, Lebanon was reliant on imports for basics like food and fuel. And with most transactions in global trade being conducted in dollars, the US currency became an essential part of Lebanon's economy. Having that in mind, by 1997, the government had opted to peg the local currency to the US dollar at a fixed rate. In turn, this made the unstable local currency stronger, offering sturdiness to the country's economy and thus allowing the government to get more financing. But the main problem was, during this time, much of that capital flowed directly into the pockets of politicians instead of being invested into necessary infrastructure. This wasn't at the forefront of everyone's minds though, because the economy was booming and everyone was fat and happy. Citizens were enjoying progressively higher standards of living, so much of the corruption and mismanagement by the government went unnoticed. But things started to take a darker tone once the foreign aid started to dry up. As this happened, politicians began to look for new ways to enrich themselves. At the time, most politicians had direct ties to or outright owned national commercial banks. Politicians and bankers designed a new way to bring money into the government. Now, imagine Lebanon's financial structure as a three-tiered cake. On the top tier, we have the government, fragmented into several pieces as we discussed, each represented by a different sect. In the middle lies the central bank, and on the base tier, we have the commercial banks. The final goal was to use the central bank's reserves to fuel government spending. To do that, they first needed to attract foreign capital into central bank reserves. To accomplish this, the central bank offered extremely high interest rates, incentivizing commercial banks to deposit their reserves with them. Since the central bank was offering such attractive returns, commercial banks had everything to gain by parking their clients' deposits there. And the plan worked. Imagine having a 10% return on a dollar deposit at a time when banks in Europe and the US were offering low to no returns on the same type of deposit. Combine this with a high level of banking secrecy and a very conservative banking practice, and Lebanon turned into a money magnet. It pulled in large amounts of foreign deposits into local banks, servicing anyone from the Middle East to Europe. As deposits started to flow in, commercial banks deposited the money at the central bank. As the central bank started to accumulate large amounts of foreign currency reserves, they started to lend that money to the government. Hidden behind the facade of Lebanon's rapidly growing economy, this scheme flew under the radar once more. As a result, government debt began to balloon, and soon Lebanon's debt to GDP ratio soared well past 100%. In itself, high debt levels are not an issue as long as the government is able to invest in infrastructure and systems that will create more growth for the economy. But, as we know, in Lebanon, this did not happen. A major chunk of these funds was landing in the pockets of the politicians, and this caused even the most basic of services to crumble. Constant electricity cuts and non-drinkable tap water became the norm.
Hassan Hoshu has lived through wars and occupation. His currency has collapsed, his savings vanished, along with a functioning state. Without fuel or money, everything is running short.
We take medication for a chronic disease we were told we may find in Beirut, but for double the price, and even then we still couldn't get it. We can't even find cough medicine and Panadol.
A powered lamppost has become a beacon for this community. We are electricity refugees, says this woman. I can't stay at home. Hoarding has become commonplace. Petrol stations, a front line where men are killed in fuel disputes. The army has been deployed.
The public outcry finally started to grow. People were angry with the corruption and mismanagement because now they could see it. But the politicians merely switched places within their ministries, and the problems persisted. As we've seen from the US banking crisis, when there's a shaky foundation, it's only a matter of time before the perfect storm arises, threatening to topple the house of cards. But it's not a bank that we're talking about here, but an entire nation's economy. For Lebanon's situation, the first domino to fall came in 2011 when conflict sparked in neighboring Syria. Over the next few years, Lebanon became a refuge for around 1.5 million displaced Syrians. This put significant pressure on Lebanon's already shaky social system. Remember, this is the same system that could hardly support their local population, let alone 1.5 million extra people. Meanwhile, the building tensions in the region created a vacuum of confidence for investors, and this reduced new foreign investment inflows. With funds drying up and a desperate need for dollar reserves to maintain its import-dependent economy, Lebanon found itself at a crossroads. Riding in on a white horse to save the country was Riyad Salameh, a former Merrill Lynch banker and the chairman of Lebanon's central bank. Using his expertise in financial engineering, he introduced a range of extremely complex financial mechanisms. Basically, he would offer commercial banks lavish returns as long as they could bring in new dollar deposits into the country. Interest rates on deposits started to skyrocket even further as local banks started to use any and all techniques they could to get foreign currency in. It was a quasi-Ponzi scheme, and the plan worked. Despite regional tensions, more capital once again flowed into the country, though success was short-lived because unfortunately, this strategy was in fact more of a double-edged sword. Sure, it brought in the funds, but it also increased the liabilities for both banks and the government due to the higher interest rates. So, the financial engineering magic transformed their national debt into foreign currency debt. debt servicing costs skyrocketed, reaching 1/3 of the country's yearly budget. Soon, foreign currency reserves started to deplete due to newfound expenses, and it soon became clear what was going on, but it was already too late. By 2017, political instability led by the Prime Minister's resignation and later the government's failure to deliver on promised reforms prompted foreign donors to pull back their investments. With no foreign investment coming in and no other means of securing the funds necessary to pay back the debt, Lebanon's only option was to take on more debt, and a debt burden quickly spiraled out of control. By 2019, the debt had reached 170% of GDP. This was the final straw, and the government was forced to default on its foreign debt. Unemployment began to rise, inflation was in the triple digits, and a once thriving nation was brought to its knees. As if the situation wasn't bad enough, a global pandemic swept through the nation, but the worst was yet to come. On August 4th, 2020, a disaster shook the country.
The entire Lebanese government has stood down following last Tuesday's catastrophic explosion in Beirut. The Prime Minister said it was the result of endemic corruption, which is bigger than the state itself. Angry protests have continued at the government's handling of the crisis as the country faces economic collapse and food shortages.
A warehouse in Beirut's port area exploded. The warehouse had been storing 2,700 tons of highly volatile ammonium nitrate since 2013. It was a clear risk, but government officials failed to take action for many years. The explosion, which caused hundreds of deaths and billions of dollars in damages, also destroyed the port responsible for 70% of Lebanon's imports. Of course, this increased import costs even further. Sky-high inflation wasn't coming down now. As for accountability, no one has been held responsible, and many politicians continue to act like nothing happened. The people of Lebanon were truly living through the darkest days, but sadly, in the years to follow, there would be little improvement. Of course, the people were angry and they protested, but nothing changed. Every effort hit a brick wall, and activists couldn't even agree on the root causes of the crises, what they should even prioritize, and the types of political reforms that they should advocate for. As for the government themselves, they were now out of options and desperate for funds. So, in all of their infinite wisdom, they decided to propose a new tax. Bizarrely, the government wanted a payment of 20 cents per day for the use of WhatsApp's video call feature. Obviously, this tax only affected the poorer people. Imposing a tax on communication only added fuel to the fire of discontent. The result? Mass protests. These were driven largely by disheartened youth, demanding a complete overhaul of the political system, which seemed to benefit the elite few at the expense of everyone else. As the political climate deteriorated, the banking sector got nervous. Fearful of a bank run that could ensue from the protests, they began to withhold foreign reserves, particularly dollars, effectively locking people out of their own deposits. It's important to remember that most people used to save their money in bank deposits. And because a lot of families sent money back home from over abroad, there was a large amount of dollar-denominated deposits held at local banks. As one can expect, taking away people's savings was not a good idea. The public were furious, and faith in the local currency diminished. People began to exchange their Lebanese pounds for dollars, and because banks no longer offered exchange services, the currency black market boomed, and this caused the exchange rate to plummet. The drop was both quick and devastating, sliding from 1,500 Lebanese pounds to the dollar before the crisis, to a street rate of 23,000 to $1 in late January 2022, and a staggering 100,000 to $1 by April 2023.
The lira and the dollar have always existed side by side in Lebanon's economy. Until 2019, the exchange rate between the two currencies was stable, with $1 equal to 1,500 pounds. The exchange rate changes daily. On this morning, a dollar was worth 21,000 pounds, almost 15 times more than 2 years ago.
The dollar rate keeps rising, so supplier prices are rising too. I have to continually adjust my prices.
So let's look at the numbers and be prepared because they're staggering. Since 2018, Lebanon has lost more than half its GDP. By July 2022, the collapse of the currency has ushered in hyperinflation. Some products have increased in price by 10 times. By the end of 2022, inflation had reached 124%. This may not really hit home, so let me give you some real-life perspective. So someone who used to earn $900 a month is now earning less than $50. And to make things worse, the minimum wage hasn't been increased since 2017. And even this dismal pay is a blessing to some, because 30% of the population is now unemployed. These shocking statistics don't fully capture the human suffering. 70% of households are struggling to make ends meet, and in more than a quarter of these households, an adult had to skip a meal due to lack of money or food resources. Parents are being forced to send their children to orphanages simply because they can't afford to feed them. Because of the shortage of foreign currency reserves, the country can't import the goods it needs, leading to significant shortages in everyday essentials. Fuel is the most significant issue. After the destruction of their main port, there are lengthy queues around gas stations where people are stuck waiting for hours. Electricity has become a fleeting luxury, now just accessible for a few hours a day. This has caused a massive crisis in hospitals, only worsened by the lack of essential medicine. Water services have taken a hit too. The country is witnessing disease outbreaks, including its first cholera outbreak in decades. As the situation worsens, a self-perpetuating cycle emerges. For instance, public teachers went on a 3-month strike since their salaries no longer cover even basic commuting costs. Most local businesses are on the brink of bankruptcy. Electricity shortages and the population's plummeting purchasing power make it impossible for companies to operate. And of course, as people begin to get more desperate, there has to be a surge in crime. It's simply become impossible to put food on the table. Desperate citizens have resorted to robbing banks, and this is simply just to get their own money back. Many of them have become national heroes, representing the grit and the strength to keep fighting against the people that put them in these circumstances. People are leaving Lebanon. The amount of people exiting increased by 450% between 2020 and 2021. Many risk their lives, undertaking dangerous journeys by sea to reach Cyprus, Turkey, and the rest of Europe. This has led to a massive brain drain, where those with high skills are the first to leave. Sectors like healthcare are suffering. Let's not also forget that there's still over 1 million refugees in Lebanon. For everyone involved, the hardship is almost too much to imagine. As for those responsible for this mess, most of them still remain in power. The true scope of the corruption is hidden, but the hints have already surfaced. After the 2019 protests, $6 billion fled the country into offshore accounts. Bankers are buying properties overseas, and even the infamous chairman of Lebanon's central bank, Riyad Salameh, who was supposed to save the country, is under investigation for alleged money laundering and embezzlement. As the curtain on Lebanon's banking and political system slowly draws back in the coming years, we will likely witness the full extent of the corruption. So what about the future? How can this be fixed? As for possible solutions, on an economic level, the solution is fairly straightforward. First up, the country desperately needs cash flow to restart essential services such as imports, electricity, water, and medicine. Next should come the restructuring of the banking sector, as well as the restructuring of social services. Without this step, the country's issues will only persist and accumulate even further. Lastly, the national currency needs to let go of the dollar peg and become a free-flowing currency, slowly rebuilding trust in financial institutions once more. This would all work in an ideal world, but reality is more complex. Unfortunately, efforts so far once again have hit a political wall and have been postponed. Lebanon has been in discussions with the IMF for a bailout plan for the past 3 years, but such aid would require the condition of government restructuring, and this would mean that the elites would lose their power. And at this time, it's a concession that the regime isn't willing to take. As we've seen before, Lebanon's root problem lies in its sectarian politics. As long as the political system remains unchanged, the ruling elites have no incentive to modify their behavior, irrespective of the suffering of the populace. With no help in sight, the people of Lebanon are carving out their own solutions. A major development has been the dollarization of the economy. Selling products and services in US dollars is an effort to sidestep the local currency, but such makeshift solutions provide their own risks. This dollarization, while aiming to control inflation and stabilize the economy, may drive even more people into poverty. Other countries like Zimbabwe and Ecuador have adopted the US dollar to counter hyperinflation and economic troubles, but with mixed results. Hence, it's unclear whether this is going to work in the long run for Lebanon. On top of that, due to the bank malfunctions, Lebanon has morphed into a cash economy. Basically, all transactions are conducted in physical currency. This means decreased tax revenues for the government.
Christine Ozier built the business through 2 pregnancies, but after the port explosion and the financial crisis, she's ready to leave.
There's an incredible strength in people. But when it comes to, finding medicine, finding bread, things like that, it doesn't matter how resilient you are.
So it's definitely a rough road ahead for the people of Lebanon, but all I can say is that I really do sincerely hope things get better. There have been multiple times throughout history where countries have gone through economic disasters and have recovered on the other end. So let's all hope that that's the case here. Alright, so that is the story of the Lebanon crisis. It's a tragic tale, but I think it's one that needs to be highlighted. So thanks for watching. My name is Dagogo, and you've been watching Cold Fusion, and I'll catch you again soon for the next episode. Cheers guys. Have a good one.
Cold Fusion. It's new thinking.
This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream and Nebula, my online streaming platform. Hi, welcome to another Cold Fusion video. This is Sri Lanka, population 22 million and an independent island off the coast of southern India. Not long ago, they were South Asia's most developed nation, but right now they're in a severe economic crisis. The country is $51 billion in debt. Rolling blackouts are rampant, the currency is crashing, medication, fuel, and some food is in short supply. Even school exams had to be cancelled because of the shortage of printing paper.
An economic crisis in Sri Lanka, which is becoming increasingly dramatic, with residents' life savings virtually disappearing into thin air. One estimate from Johns Hopkins University shows real inflation at over 130% in March. The government is even asking airlines to stop refueling in the country to save on fuel.
Many Sri Lankans have had enough of the horrific situation. The homes of government officials have been torched, and the sitting Prime Minister even had to flee to a naval base for his own safety. Protesters have also stormed the presidential residence. They were swimming in the president's pool, eating his food, and drinking his alcohol. So how could such a disaster happen? Well, first, we need to look at the Rajapaksa's family.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
The Rajapaksas has been a powerful family in the country for a while. Their wealth came from rice and coconut farming, and their power from their activities in politics. In Sri Lankan politics, you have to be somebody to be elected. As Razeen Sally, a professor at the National University of Singapore, told the Washington Post, quote, "You cannot win in politics if you're not from an established family." The second of 9 children, Mahinda Rajapaksas, became president in 2005, and for 10 years, the country became a family business. As the family's influence grew, soon other brothers, sons, nephews, cousins, daughter-in-laws, and other relatives joined the government, occupying top positions in various administrations. Sri Lanka was now a family affair. Mahinda named his brother Gotabaya as defense secretary, while Basil and their oldest brother Jamal were placed in charge of irrigation and economic development. Sri Lanka enjoyed years of growth, fueled by a mountain of foreign debt, but for much of their rule, things were going well. Despite some critics, many Sri Lankans were fans of the ruling family, not only for bringing up the country in social standing, but also for bringing peace to the nation. From 1983 to 2009, there was a horrific civil war in the country. A rebel group called the Tamil Tigers would fight against the government, citing discrimination. After a 26-year military campaign, the Sri Lankan Armed Forces militarily defeated the Tamil Tigers in May of 2009, and this brought the civil war to an end. At this time, the president and the defense ministry were brothers. After the defeat of the rebels, the pair were hailed as heroes. Mahinda enjoyed the adulation of voters, who approved of his bloody, yet decisive victory in a 26-year civil war against the Tamil rebels. But it wasn't a squeaky clean image for the brothers. Allegations of corruption, including questionable deals with Chinese state counterparts, swirled around Mahinda. His brother, Gotabaya, was also implicated, though to a lesser extent. He was facing scrutiny over the purchase of MiG fighters from Ukraine. But these scandals didn't stop the family from spending big. He promised huge infrastructure projects, including a Chinese-built airport, which sits largely empty. He tried to jumpstart growth by borrowing heavily and attracting foreign capital by propping up the Sri Lankan rupee. In the short term, the strategy worked. The economy boomed, causing a per capita gross domestic product to more than double from 2006 to 2014. This vaulted Sri Lanka past Ukraine, the Philippines, and Indonesia. It lifted 1.6 million people out of poverty and gave rise to a large middle class. By 2019, Sri Lanka ascended to the ranks of the World Bank's upper middle income countries. Though all of that growth came at a cost, Sri Lanka's external debt tripled from 2006 to 2012, pushing total public debt to 119% of GDP. In 2015, these policies were suspended, but the debt continued to accumulate. With each passing year, the family government made even more mistakes. Each mistake led to ever greater risk. When the military brother, Gotabaya, got into power in 2019, he promised tax cuts to get elected. When this came around, the government lost 25% of its revenue. To make things worse, in 2020, COVID smashed tourism. For Sri Lanka, tourist income was a huge source of funding to pay back foreign debt. Then, 2021 rolls around and Russia and Ukraine go to war. In an ill twist of fate, before the war, Russians frequently made up the biggest share of Sri Lankans' tourists, with Ukrainians not far behind. As the flights to Moscow were suspended and the Ukrainians are at war, Sri Lanka's tourism industry suffers even more. In April of 2021, the Rajapaksa government made another fatal mistake. To prevent the drain of foreign exchange reserves, all fertilizer imports were completely banned. This move was extremely radical, as no country can feasibly run their food supply on 100% organic fertilizer on a whim. Farmers overnight had to stop producing and the food supply collapsed. The country had to start importing rice and other food goods, and the price of food exploded. Rubber and tea, two major exports, also ground to a halt. The government reversed the policy in November of 2021, but the damage was already done.
Last year, in a highly controversial move, the Sri Lankan government banned the use and import of chemical fertilizers overnight in a bid to become the first country in the world to fully adopt organic farming. While the ban was later reversed after protests, the crop yield was already affected.
The income we get is not enough to cover our expenses. This is the only work we do. We have no other work.
And then things went from bad to worse. The country was spending more than it made, imported more than it exported. As a consequence, its foreign reserves began to run dry. This in itself isn't too unusual, as a lot of countries do this and end up borrowing more money to keep themselves afloat. But the difference here is that the foreign debt for Sri Lanka is so high that they can't even pay the interest to keep the debt expansion going. To make things even worse, oil prices were exploding internationally, so importing that cost even more than normal. And being a small island dependent on deliveries by sea made this a nightmare for Sri Lanka. The inability to import led to food shortages as foreign exchange reserves remain under strain. In February of 2022, the official inflation numbers rose to 17.5%. By June, it was 55%. The price of cooking gas, for example, is almost 3 times higher than it was just a few months ago. Even printing paper is hard to come by, forcing schools to close and cancel exams. In March of 2022, the Sri Lankan rupee posted its biggest single-day decline in more than 40 years. These next numbers highlight just how fast the situation is deteriorating. Sri Lanka's foreign currency reserves at the end of 2019 stood at 7.6 billion. This had fallen to 1.93 billion in March of 2020. And by July of 2022, all that remains is 50 million. There is no longer enough foreign currency to import basics such as fuel. On June 29, 2022, the country suspended fuel sales. It only had enough fuel for just one more day, and it will be given out in absolute emergencies. It was the first country to ban sales of petrol since the fuel crisis in the 1970s. Before long, the situation was horrific. Citizens began starving, and there was a shortage of everything, food and fuel being the most pressing. Long fuel lines are a common sight. Arguments occur and fights break out. One rickshaw driver even dies of heat stroke. The government is now so short on funds that it's going to start printing money to pay employees' salaries, and most of us know how that turns out. It's basically the end of the line for the Sri Lankan economy. Sri Lanka no longer has money to import goods, and they can no longer function to produce enough revenue. In April, the government defaulted on its external debt worth 51 billion. 7 billion more is due at the end of the year. Starting in early April of 2021, protests began to erupt all over Sri Lanka. At first, the government tried to squash the protesters, triggering deadly crashes across the country, but they couldn't hold back the tide of anger. The Rajapaksa brothers, once hailed by many as heroes for winning the civil war, are now reviled as leaders. It's a dramatic fall from grace for a family that dominated Sri Lankan politics for over a decade. The former president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, had to be evacuated from his official residence after protesters attempted to storm the house. Other family houses of the Rajapaksas have also been targeted elsewhere in Sri Lanka.
People are so frustrated.
because of Rajapaksa.
We need our money back. We need our country back. We are here to support us, these people.
I mean, everyone can see that how much we're suffering. There's lines everywhere, gas, petrol.
Currently, Sri Lanka is in a very risky situation with great uncertainty. And just to highlight this, as I was finishing up the episode, more news broke. On June 10th, hundreds of thousands of protesters broke into President Gotabaya's official residence.
The moment the dam broke, and they swarmed into the office of a president already fled.
At 10 a.m. local time, he fled. Gotabaya's motorcade was seen speeding down the highway out of the city. His secretary and other officials didn't know his whereabouts, but he was later stopped at the airport trying to flee the country to Dubai. After he left, protesters wearing helmets and waving Sri Lankan flags broke into the president's residence, some cooking food in the kitchen, while others are seen swimming in the pool. There was even a piano sing-along in one of the rooms to lift morale. And for the first time, several Sri Lankan military personnel joined the protesters, marking a turning point in the government's control of the situation. The protests and storming of the government residence also shows what happens when governments lose control of an economy. All other world governments should be watching this closely. Overall, it's a tragic situation, a potent combination of government mismanagement and external economic and geopolitical factors. Moreover, without a stable government, it's going to be very difficult to negotiate loans or restructure the country's debts.
So it looks like the end of the Rajapaksa family dynasty and the long years of complete control it exercised over this island nation.
So how can this be fixed? Well, basically, the only option is to get loans. Sri Lanka is seeking emergency loans of $3 billion to pay for essential imports such as fuel. The World Bank has agreed to lend $600 million, and the government is also asking for $4 billion from the International Monetary Fund. The IMF said that the government must raise interest rates and taxes as a condition for the loan, which would make the country's cost of living crisis even worse. They're also seeking help from China, India, Qatar, Australia, Japan, the US, and more. Sri Lanka and India have signed a $1 billion credit line for importing essentials, including food and medicine. Sri Lanka owes $6.5 billion to China, and the two are in talks on how to restructure the debt. China agreed to bolster Sri Lankan's foreign currency reserves by swapping the Sri Lankan rupee for its currency, the renminbi. Though since then, China has signalled displeasure over Sri Lanka also approaching the IMF for help. The Rajapaksas are now not only concerned for their political future, but also for their safety and security when a new government takes over. We can only hope that things turn around for the nation and they can get the resources they need to rebuild their economy. No citizen of any nation deserves what has happened to the people of Sri Lanka. So I've been sitting on this script for a couple of months, just waiting and seeing if things would improve, but they really haven't. So I think it's ultimately important that people know what's going on here. So stay safe out there if you're from Sri Lanka. Generally speaking, the news cycle can be quite negative, but what if you could just leave it all behind? Put a stop to the endless doom scrolling and internet arguments? Well, that's what many people have started to do. It's a phenomena dubbed the dumb phone revolution. It's living a life with a phone that only does calls and texts. I've made a Cold Fusion episode on it, and it's an interesting look into why and how this is happening. If you want to see this episode right now, you can head to my streaming platform, Nebula. Nebula is a streaming platform made by creators for creators. It's going to allow me to experiment with different kinds of content without having to worry about demonetization or the algorithm, and best of all, it's ad-free. Nebula features YouTube's best educational content creators like Real Engineering, Polymatter, and Mustard. Nebula is partnering with CuriosityStream. We have a deal where you can sign up with the link below, not only to get access to CuriosityStream, but you'll also get Nebula for free. It's not a trial, you'll have it as long as you're a CuriosityStream member. CuriosityStream has thousands of documentaries, everything from Edward Snowden to the Vietnam War, to space and quantum physics, to the soothing voice of David Attenborough. It's all there. For a limited time, CuriosityStream is offering 26% off their annual plan. That's less than $15 per year for both CuriosityStream and Nebula. It really is the best deal in streaming. It's a great way to support my channel and educational content as a whole. So click the link in the description or go to the URL. Clicking that link really helps my channel. Thank you. Some housekeeping before I leave you. For those of you who follow my music, be sure to check out my new album, Hello World, on Bandcamp. It'll be on Spotify soon. But yeah, that's it from me. My name is Dagogo, and you've been watching Cold Fusion, and I'll see you again soon for the next episode. Cheers guys. Have a good one. Hi, welcome to another episode of Cold Fusion, where I cover anything in science, technology, business, or history. On this channel, we've seen plenty of cases of scams and frauds. But what if the very same financial institutions who we trust with our money end up committing some of the biggest frauds of all time? It's not fun to think about, but it's almost a fact of life now. Now don't get me wrong, not all banks are bad. But some of the largest financial institutions are no stranger to deceit. In this episode, we'll take a look at some of the biggest frauds ever committed by banks, and then we'll end on an exclusive story with Rob Bestian, a licensed stockbroker of over 8 years, who has agreed to publicly blow the whistle here on Cold Fusion. Rob used to work at one of the biggest banks in the United States, but has since left. Let's begin.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
Up first, we have the Wells Fargo fake account scandal. Wells Fargo, the third largest bank in the United States, ruined their reputation in one big catastrophe. It all started when Wells Fargo executives wanted their staff to meet aggressive sales targets in their financial products business. These products were things like mortgages or credit cards. Employees who met these targets were eligible for promotions and bonuses, while employees who did not meet these sales targets faced relentless pressure and even termination. Success by retail banks was measured in part by the average number of products held by a customer. So to appear more successful, Wells Fargo employees then created millions of savings and checkings accounts for customers without their knowledge or approval. Why? Because they wanted to sell multiple products to the same customers. For example, a customer with a checking account might also be given a credit card that they didn't ask for. To achieve the sales goals set forth by the company, bank branch staff resorted to inappropriate activities. They started using their own contact information on forms to prevent customers from discovering the scam. Employees were accused of creating fraudulent checkings and savings accounts by moving money out of existing accounts into the new ones. This was made possible by setting the customer's PIN numbers to 0000. Now the bankers had full control of the client's accounts without them knowing. As early as 2011, the Wall Street Journal smelt a rat and ran a story of the illegal practices, but nobody really cared. Another article in 2013 was published by the Los Angeles Times. This time, it focused on the intense pressure on bank managers and individual bankers to produce ever-increasing sales and even mathematically impossible quotas, but still, nobody cared. Eventually, many of the bank's customers noticed something strange. They questioned fees on accounts that they didn't ask for or didn't even realize they owned. The influx of complaints finally drew the attention of regulatory agencies. The fraud started to gain wider attention in 2016 when a group of government regulatory agencies fined the bank a combined $185 million.
So that's my question about Wells Fargo. How far up the line did this go?
This generation of executives that either could have known or should have known, and in some cases we talked to people and they said, look, they were told that there were suspicious numbers on the platform here, and they decided not to do anything about it. I mean, someone told us 42 debit accounts by a single banker in Southern California. Nobody said as a manager, hey, that looks a little bit fishy, maybe I should look into that, perhaps this is made up.
Wells Fargo subsequently dealt with civil and criminal lawsuits and paid out over $2.7 billion. John Stumpf, Wells Fargo chief executive at the height of the scandal, was forced to resign. When all was said and done, the bank had created over 3.5 million fraudulent accounts.
But Wells Fargo traded its hard-earned reputation for short-term profits and harmed untold numbers of customers along the way.
I had 15 accounts at once. It was just very frustrating. And these are accounts I never opened.
Interest rates are an important part of any economy. But what if the interest rate of corporate loans, student loans, mortgages, and more were all controlled by a single mechanism, a mechanism that was fraudulently being altered? The London Interbank Offered Rate, otherwise known as LIBOR rate, is exactly that. The LIBOR scandal was probably the biggest financial crime that you've never heard of.
One way of judging how healthy they were was by how much interest they were paying to borrow cash, which would also affect the cost of mortgages and loans. The way LIBOR worked was that each bank had to estimate how much interest they'd have to pay to borrow cash. Then the rates from all the banks were averaged. That's the LIBOR rate.
In total, LIBOR itself underpins $350 trillion of value based in derivatives. By manipulating the LIBOR, the traders in question were inherently causing a cascade of mispriced financial assets throughout the entire global financial system. The LIBOR is supposed to be the total assessment of health of the financial system, because if the banks feel confident about the state of things, they report a low interest number. And if the member banks feel a low degree of confidence and see risk in the financial system, they report a higher interest rate number. The huge flaw in this approach was that the estimates that the bank gave on interest rates was being used to determine the actual LIBOR interest rate. None of the banks actually had to borrow and lend at the same rate mentioned in LIBOR. The banks merely had to tell the regulators that they would do so. In practice, they would be borrowing and lending at completely different rates. They could then profit on the difference between what they reported and what they actually traded with. Banks realized that they could form a cartel and rig the LIBOR rate in their favor. They got together and consistently fudged their numbers. They were providing inflated or deflated interest rates to regulators for years. Unfortunately, the fraud also impacted corporations and individuals who had loans based on the LIBOR. For the banks, there was a lot of money to be made. In the first quarter of 2009, Citigroup had interest rate swaps of a notional value of $14.2 trillion and Bank of America $49.7 trillion. These are huge numbers, and just a small change in the LIBOR rate can make them piles of cash. For example, a 1% interest rate change that happens instantaneously could see billions in profit. And there was much affected in the real world. One example is home mortgages. Homeowners in the United States filed a class action lawsuit in October 2012. The lawsuit was against 12 of the largest banks that were fudging the numbers in the LIBOR rate, and this made mortgage repayments more expensive than they should have been. Deutsche Bank was one of the biggest participants in the fraud. They were fined $1.74 billion. ANZ Bank in Australia, Barclays Bank in the UK, and the Royal Bank of Scotland were some of the other banks involved. The fines offered were nothing compared to the money that they made. Gold and Silver Market Rigging by J.P. Morgan. In 1974, the futures market began trading in the gold and silver markets. Futures contracts are basically an agreement for two parties to trade an asset at an agreed date and price. In this case, both parties are trading gold and silver. As time went on, more and more futures contracts were created at will, essentially increasing the virtual supply of gold and silver when in reality no new metal was ever mined. In fact, the prices and the amount of gold and silver traded have very little to do with the underlying supply of metals. As you could imagine, this system was ripe for abuse. By 2018, more imaginary gold and silver was traded in a few days than was actually mined in an entire year. In 2018, only 34 tons of registered gold stocks were delivered through futures contracts, and yet 260,000 tons of gold was traded on the COMEX, which is more gold than has ever been mined in history and 86 times the annual gold mining supply. Between 2008 and 2016, JP Morgan engaged in a practice that manipulated the price of gold and silver. What they were doing was something called spoofing. This manipulative practice is designed to create the illusion of demand or a lack thereof. The goal of spoofing is to move market prices in a way that financially benefits the banks. For a very long time, this idea was labelled as a conspiracy theory to some in the financial industry. In an interview with CNBC, aired in April 2013, financial whistleblower Andrew Maguire described how mysterious traders allegedly working for JP Morgan waited till most of the major markets closed and then used a separate market known as the COMEX to trade virtual silver anonymously. They used algorithms to bounce in and out of the futures market in the blink of an eye. 400 contracts a second. The thing is, each contract represents 5,000 troy ounces of silver. In one instance, Maguire described unusual market movements that saw the sale of 45,000 contracts with a profit of $80,000 per contract, totaling a profit of $3.6 billion for the mystery seller. These kind of strange market movements weren't that unusual. The difference between the digital gold traded on the futures market versus the actual amount of physical gold that actually exists has now become so vast that now there are hundreds of claims of ownership on every single ounce of gold. In other words, for every ounce of gold exchanged in the futures market, each trader thinks that they have a claim to that gold and could take physical delivery of the metal if needed. But the thing is, hundreds more traders also think the same thing. Let's just hope everyone doesn't want their physical gold at once. In 2019, JP Morgan was accused of being, quote, a criminal enterprise by a federal prosecutor for the rigging of the gold and silver market. In September of 2020, the Department of Justice issued a $920 million fine for the rigging. In reality, they could be potentially earning trillions. So ultimately, these fines are just the cost of doing business, and the practice still continues to this day.
They had been spoofing the market for the better part of 8 years, and silver, gold, platinum, palladium, all of the precious metals. This is a pretty big deal. There's always talk, and listen, I've been covering gold for almost 8 years now, and there's always talk of people saying, oh, there's some sort of manipulation going on in the market. You probably hear that in every market. But now that this actually comes up, it really kind of makes you think twice, like, wow, this is interesting. They're claiming racketeering charges. These are high claims.
Yeah.
For the second half of this video, we're going to take a deep dive into the next scandal, which is still ongoing today. One of the biggest frauds of all, possibly in the hundreds of billions of dollars, is the ETN scandal. This one is notable because it's still ongoing. This has flown under the radar of the general public and was brought to my attention by Rob Bezgian, a broker of 8 years. He's looked pretty deeply into the situation with these products and believes that this is one of the largest financial frauds of all time. After launching a complaint to the SEC, he's agreed to talk to me about what's happening. But before we look into it, we need to set the groundwork. It all begins with the class of products called an exchange-traded note, or ETN. ETNs have proven extremely risky, transferring all the risk and losses to buyers, while the banks make a profit. As you'll see, some analysts have claimed that they literally serve no economic purpose. Banks such as UBS Group and Citigroup, and notoriously Credit Suisse, have all taken part. So what are ETNs? According to the SEC, ETNs are unsecured debt obligations. This means that they aren't backed by any underlying asset. An ETN is basically a figment of imagination by Wall Street financial engineers. The point of them is to mimic the performance of an underlying index, such as oil or foreign currencies, but it's not backed by them. They are, in practice, IOUs from a bank which promises to deliver the returns of an index in return for a fee. Leveraged ETNs can offer multiples of the performance of an index. Inverse ETNs are based on the opposite performance. When the price of an ETN goes down, banks make money. So naturally, what does the price do over an extended period of time? It goes down. The long-term value of an ETN is engineered to go to zero. Credit Suisse even said so. For example, their reverse VIX ETN, which mirrors the reverse price action of an index that measures the volatility in the stock market, states that, quote, the long-term expected value of your ETN is zero. If you hold onto your ETN as a long-term investment, it is likely that you will lose all or a substantial portion of your investment. End quote. The only issue is that this was buried in page 197 of their prospectus, far from a place where the casual buyer would be aware. In short, the issuers, which are the big banks, want the price of these ETNs to drop as quickly as possible, then they mark to market the gains on their balance sheet. We'll have Rob who'll give us his rundown on the fraud that he's uncovered. A link to his full video will be in the description below.
Hi, my name is Rob Bezshin. Over the next few minutes, I would like to go over two major parts of my whistleblower complaints. First, I will explain the mechanics and mathematics of how leveraged and inverse exchange-traded products operate. Second, I will discuss the extreme use of reverse splits. I've constructed a narrative, or game, to demonstrate the basic yet counterintuitive mathematics of the fraud. In this narrative, there are three participants, two players and the house. The players win based on opposite outcomes of the flip of a coin. Both players will start with $1,000 and the house will collect the losses and pay out the winnings. The house's balance will only increase if there is a net loss by both players. Upon first observation, one might think this is a binary outcome with an equal probability of profit and loss, just as a coin flip is binary. One winner and one loser. Let's play 10 rounds and see just how wrong that assumption is. As you can see from this table, the house took 60% of the pot without ever taking financial risk, investing any of their own funds, or adding economic value. Player 1 won 60% of the time and still lost 29%, and player 2 suffered a devastating loss. This is exactly the way leverage and inverse ETNs and their pairs work. They are mathematically, and I repeat, mathematically guaranteed to go down 100% of the time. And the more time that goes by, the more dramatic the decline. These products were designed and constructed this way on purpose to enrich the issuers, the distributors, the brokers, and advisors that peddle this.
So, why would people in their right mind buy something that the price is guaranteed to go to zero? Well, as it turns out, it's possible that they don't know that the value is going down at all. Through some financial trickery, banks can avoid suspicion by manipulating the price of these products. So how does this work? Well, through a neat trick called a reverse split, an issuer of an ETN can reduce the number of shares to increase the price. For example, in a 10-to-1 reverse split, there are 1/10 the number of shares, but the price of each share has increased 10 times. In the end, the net asset value stays the same, but the price looks 10 times higher to an uneducated outsider. Reverse splits falsely cause the ETN price to be higher than it otherwise would have been, and this allows issuers to create additional notes at a higher price. The higher the starting price, the more money the banks make.
Remember, the issuing financial institutions are constantly creating more notes and selling them to market. Reverse splits allow them to issue notes at a higher price. Certainly few investors would purchase a security which was priced at $20 18 months ago and now trades at under $1.
An ETN called the TVIX started at a price of $2 billion in December of 2010, but by December of 2019, its price was $51.29. So, it's actually down 99.99992%.
In the example of TVIX, over the course of 7 years, 2012 to 2019, 25 million notes were converted to one. Let me repeat, 25 million to one, making the ETN price 25 million times larger than it should have been.
So where did that $2 billion go? Out of the hands of investors and into the pockets of the banks. UGAS, another ETN, which mimics the performance of the natural gas sector, does the same. As the product continued to decay, the banks would continue to carry out reverse splits at the expense of unsuspecting investors.
These were all part of my original complaint, and since have been delisted, but no fines to the issuers. Coincidence? Probably. Under this logic, if Enron had just done large enough reverse splits and issued more stock at a higher manipulated price, it would still be a $60 security and in great financial health.
The other thing you have to keep in mind too is that unlike an ETF, these exchange traded notes don't have a board. So there really isn't this oversight, committee to sort of look over those things. So these exchange traded notes, they're like, hey, look, why don't we just do the same kind of thing and put it out there and see what happens? but then they get left without anyone really, to account for it, and it's a problem. These are not exchange traded funds. These are notes, and it's everyone out there listening.
Right.
Look under the hood.
In 2018, a Credit Suisse reverse VIX ETN exploded, hurting investors but leaving the bank unscathed. Paul Gambles, co-founder of financial advisory firm MBMG Group, called it, quote, an accident waiting to happen, and he stated that the products served no economic purpose. The product was blamed for causing a negative feedback loop of market selling. The banks lost no money, but the holders of the ETN did. The bank actually booked profits for the loss of value of the fund. To make things worse, these financial products are passed through distributors and sellers to unknowing, unsophisticated investors, a move which most would call predatory behavior. In his professional career, Rob has seen similar things go on. After much controversy, Credit Suisse delisted their UGAS ETN in July of 2020. On looking at this to test out his theory, Rob decided to mirror what the banks were doing. He consistently makes significant profits in the markets, and this is one of the #1 red flags in trading. The same flag that alerted investigators to jump onto Bernie Madoff.
Let's pull up some ETN pair charts and see if my game analysis plays out in real life. By mimicking what the issuers do legally, it's possible to generate returns well in excess of 40% a year, every year. This, in my opinion, is the nail in the coffin of any defense of these products by regulators or by the issuers. When the world learns of the fraud and can follow along in real time, the opportunity to exploit the public, which this fraud does, goes away. I can guarantee I'm not the only one that knows how these products operate. They were designed this way on purpose. And I'm willing to bet there are powerful hedge funds shorting the out of these products and making billions. It's important to remember ETNs are considered debt on the issuer's balance sheet. As the price of the ETNs decrease, their profit from issuing the security increases.
With further investigation, it was found that these products weren't tracking their underlying indexes properly.
In March 2020, many of these products were collapsing in dramatic fashion, both leveraged ETN and ETFs, which I had predicted months before in my SEC filings. Remember, these should have inverse performance intraday, meaning if one was down 10%, its inverse pair should be up 10%. This did not happen. Another failure. At the expense of purchasers and with measurable direct benefit to the issuers as they marked to market these products with huge multi-billion-dollar daily gains. Is this fair or is this fraud? Most of the ETNs I listed in my initial whistleblower complaints and all ETNs from Credit Suisse have now been delisted, but not before many of the issuers made many tens of billions. Are they going to quietly escape into the night without criticism, keeping tens of billions of investors' money? That's up to you and me. The SEC recently fined some of these parties for these products, which was part of my initial complaint, as well as a large point of my discussion with the SEC on the phone in March of 2020.
To Rob, the whole scheme of leveraged and inverse ETNs appears to be a giant fraud. Rob has submitted 2 whistleblower complaints to the SEC, the last of which was on the 2nd of January 2020. These complaints usually progress slowly and take years to play out. Harry Markopoulos, who uncovered the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme, was ignored and not believed for years. But once Bernie's fraud fell apart, everyone was willing to listen, but not before. So in summary, knowing that the banks are cheating and rigging their way at the expense of others isn't anything new, but seeing the extent that some institutions go to is staggering. From creating fake accounts, to rigging the gold and silver markets, to the rigging of interest rates and creating fake financial instruments, it really makes you wonder. And we didn't even touch on the derivative bets that went wrong, that made the housing crisis in America turn into a global financial issue, or the 2019 rigging of the currency exchange market that involved 11 banks, and so much more. It's clear that there's plenty of corruption out there, but hopefully justice can be served over time. The hope of this episode is that at a minimum, it raises questions to those that have a responsibility to keep our financial system running with honesty, keep investors protected, and at a minimum, dive deeper.
Is it likely that any regulators are going to admit dropping the ball and not adequately protecting investors? It's important we ask these and more tough questions and bring this to broader attention.
So if anyone out there is watching that is a regulator, or at least has some sway, take a look into the ETN issue. Regarding the ETN fraud and related products, Rob is in the process of submitting a third whistleblower complaint to the SEC. He's going to provide a mathematical proof or white paper describing the mathematics behind the fraud and how he's able to generate such large profits, essentially only by mimicking the issuers of the product. He'll be making this information public shortly. If you want to know more details about the fraud, I'll leave a link to Rob's video below. For me personally, although I can't 100% be sure, I do think it looks suspicious. If Rob's claim of making returns in excess of 40% per year is indeed true, there are some huge questions that should be raised with regulators. Okay, so that's about it from me. Thanks for watching the whole way through. My name is Dagogo, and you've been watching Cold Fusion, and I'll see you again soon for the next episode. Cheers guys, have a good one.
Cold Fusion. It's new thinking.